Chapter 968. Xiao Huan, what's wrong? Did someone bully you? Xiao Huan had been listless for the past 2 days. Today, in half a day, Li Yi found that she was in a daze 3 times. When she sat alone at the stone table in the courtyard, Li Yi walked over and sat opposite her, asking with concern. No, Xiao Huan shook her head. She could not say that it was because the servant girl called Xiao Qing was too diligent and took away all the work that was supposed to be done by her. Moreover, the son-in-law seemed to treat that Miss Xiao Qing differently. This was the first time he allowed another servant girl to grind the ink for him, and also the first time he allowed another servant girl to rub his shoulders when he was bathing. These things were all done by her in the past. Li Yi looked at her and said in disbelief, "Really?" The servant girl twisted her fingers together and looked at him pitifully. She asked, "Son-in-law, do you not like Xiao Huan anymore?" Li Yi did not know what the servant girl was thinking. Surprised, he got up and sat beside her. Pinching her face, he asked, "Who said that? Who said son-in-law doesn't like Xiao Huan?" The servant girl said pitifully, "But son-in-law doesn't need Xiao Huan to grind the ink, he doesn't need Xiao Huan to bathe." Li Yi then knew that she was actually jealous of Ruoqing. Ruoqing's identity as the Empress of Heaven had already been exposed. Although Li Xian did not let those people investigate further, but if she appeared in the capital with her original appearance, there would still be some trouble. So she ordered most of the followers of the holy religion to leave the capital, creating the illusion that the Empress of Heaven had already left the capital. Then, she disguised herself as a servant girl and came back without anyone knowing. Not to mention the other things of the holy religion, but the level of disguise, Li Yi himself had a deep understanding. With a mask on, even one's own parents would not be able to recognize it. Of course, he couldn't be more familiar with Ruoqing. This familiarity didn't just come from her face. On the first day he entered the mansion, he had recognized her at first sight. Knowing that she was Ruoqing, she naturally could not treat her like an ordinary servant girl, so she specially arranged for her to stay by her side, and arranged a room for her alone. Who would have thought that such a little difference would actually be discovered by Xiao Huan? Li Yi pulled her over and asked with a smile, "Are you jealous of little Qing?" The little maid sniffled. "Of course not." Li Yi leaned close to her ear and whispered a few words. Xiao Huan's eyes suddenly widened. She said in disbelief, "How is this possible? How could Xiao Qing be? Have you forgotten that the son-in-law also has a mask like that?" Xiao Huan was startled. Her face revealed a look of realization, and then she became a little embarrassed. If little Qing was Miss Ruoqing, then it wouldn't be a problem. Why would it be a problem if it was Miss Ruoqing? Even she couldn't understand it herself. If he didn't explain it clearly to Xiao Huan, who knew what she would think? The Li family was so big, and there were so many people. This matter, Li Yi didn't even have the time to tell Rui. If he showed any abnormalities, Ruoqing's efforts would be in vain. "Second madam, what's the matter?" The new servant girl of the Li family walked into a room and asked the woman in the room. Drunk Ink looked up at her and said, "It's nothing much. I heard that little Qing is good at grinding ink. I was just about to write a few words and wanted to ask for your help." Little Qing walked to the desk and said with a faint smile, "This is what I should do." There were not only the 2 of them in the room. When she was grinding ink, little Zhu sat on the other side of the desk with one hand under her chin, murmuring, "Where did Sister Ruoqing go?" Little Cui jeered at the side, "It must be that Sister Ruoqing thinks you are too annoying and doesn't want you anymore. Say it again. What's wrong with saying it again?" "You are just annoying." The 2 little servant girls quickly began to quarrel. Drunk Ink ignored them and looked at little Qing who was grinding ink. She asked, "Where is little Qing from?" "She grew up in the capital." Drunk Ink shook her head and said, "Little Qing is very much like a good friend of mine, but she grew up in Qing and Prefecture and only came to the capital 2 years ago." Little Qing smiled and did not speak. Drunk Ink asked again, "Who else is in the family?" Little Ching replied, only me. The two of them chatted like this. Not long after, Little Ching put down the ink and said, Second madam, the ink is ready. If there is nothing else, I will go down first. Drunk Ink crossed her arms and looked at her, asking, How long are you going to pretend for? Little Ching looked surprised and asked, Second madam, what are you talking about? Drunk Ink suddenly hugged her and put her hands on her chest. This is the feeling. Do you still want to pretend? Ruoqing's face was red and she hurriedly said, Drunk Ink, what are you doing? Let go of me. At this moment, her voice was very different from before. Not calling me second madam now. Drunk Ink looked at her with a proud expression and said, Little Chui, close the door. Hearing the young Miss's order, Little Chui immediately ran over and closed the door. Ruoqing's expression finally became flustered and she hurriedly said, Drunk Ink, what are you going to do? Don't do anything stupid. Drunk Ink looked at her and snorted. You even dare to lie to me, of course you will be punished according to the family rules. Hearing the words, family rules, Ruoqing's face became even redder. She looked at Little Zhu and said anxiously, Yuzhu, come help me. Little Zhu rolled up her sleeves and ran over, asking excitedly, Sister Drunk Ink, how do you want me to help you? Ever since Li Duan could walk steadily, he liked to walk, and Rui did not have to watch him all the time. Now it was approaching the Lantern Festival. For the Li family, the most important day of this month was not the Lantern Festival, but the happy event of welcoming Drunk Ink into the family at the end of the month. Rui handed over a booklet and said, This is the guest list written by Old Madam. Husband, take a look and see if anyone is missing. It's time to have someone write an invitation. Old Madam is familiar with this kind of thing. I don't think she will miss anyone. Li Yi looked at it and put it aside. Rui looked at him and asked again, Miss Ruoqing is gone. Husband, are you really not going to look for her? Li Yi was actually about to tell her about this matter, but he did not expect Rui to speak first. He said awkwardly, You may not know, but actually, Little Ching is Miss Ruoqing. Unlike what Li Yi had imagined, Rui's face did not show much surprise. She looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, I thought husband would hide this matter from me for a few more days. Li Yi said in surprise, Wife, you know all about it. There are many ways to tell a person apart from their appearance. Figure, behavior, aura. Rui looked at him and said, Judging people by their appearance is the worst way. Li Yi explained, Ruoqing's identity is special. If others know, it will be troublesome. I don't blame husband. I know all this. Rui leaned on his shoulder and asked softly, But I don't know how many good sisters I have. Li Yi said in surprise, Wife, don't you only have one sister, Rui? Including Xiao Huan, there are only two. Rui shook her head and said, Other than Rui and Xiao Huan, there are also Sister Zumo, Sister Ruoqing, Sister Emingzu, and Sister Lin from the Qi Kingdom. It depends on husband whether there are any Sister Lin, Li Yi shuddered. He thought that spring was coming, but at this moment, he felt that the weather was getting colder and colder. The weather was getting colder. Keep warm and avoid catching a cold. Chapter 969. Never underestimate a woman. If she had the identity of a grandmaster in addition to being a woman, then she should not be underestimated even more. This was what Li Yi had learned from his own experience. In fact, I have long known about Miss Ruoqing's feelings for my husband. Rui leaned against his chest and said, In the past few years, from Qing and prefecture to the capital, such a large brothel has been taken care of by a woman. I can imagine how hard she has worked. If it were not for the fact that she already loves my husband to the bone, which woman would be willing to do this for a man? She does not want to be the empress who is respected by all. She only wants to be the little Qing who follows my husband. How can I not see it? There are not many women in the world who value affection and righteousness so much, but my husband has met all of them. Why is my husband so lucky? I want to bite you." Ruoqing's identity was no longer a secret to Rui and the others. But in the mansion, she still called herself Little Qin, and did all the things that a servant girl should do. After all, her other identity was a little too shocking. There was a bite mark of love on his neck in exchange for Rui's acknowledgement of Ruoqing. No matter how broad-minded Rui was, it was impossible for her to remain calm from beginning to end in this kind of thing. So when she proposed that good things come in pairs, and let drunken Mo and Ruoqing enter the Li family at the same time, he did not agree. It was better to take this matter step by step. While eating, Mississippi Lu, who was sitting next to him, glanced at him and asked, "What's wrong with your neck?" Drunken Mo also looked over with a puzzled expression. Li Yi looked at Rui. Rui's pretty face was slightly red. She lowered her head and bit her chopsticks, and at the same time, gave him a threatening look. Li Yi swallowed the words he was about to say. Rui's threat was much more useful than Mississippi Lu's. Before Zuamo and Ruoqing married into the Li family openly, ignoring Rui's threat, he could only stay alone in the room at night. He would rather offend Mississippi Lu than Rui. He picked up a mouthful of food, touched the bite mark on his neck, and said casually, "Oh, you mean this?" "I had nothing better to do, so I bit it randomly." Xiao Huan put down her chopsticks and twisted her head to see if she could bite her own neck. Mississippi Lu also put down her chopsticks and looked at him with her arms crossed. "Take another bite and we'll see." Li Yi asked in surprise, "Here?" Mississippi Lu nodded. "Right here." Li Yi thought about it and said, "All right then." Seeing this, Xiao Huan immediately turned her head, wanting to see how her son-in-law could do this action that she could not do. Li Yi rinsed his mouth and then looked at Mississippi Lu. To be precise, he stared at her snow-white neck and asked, "Have you washed your neck?" Too many things had happened in the 4th year of Jing He. The fall of the Cui family, the loss of power of the king of Shu, and a large number of forces in the capital had suffered a bloody purge. Some families fell, and others stood up. The current situation in the capital and even in the Jing kingdom had been very stable. The people's hearts and the imperial court had stabilized. Although Li Xian had just succeeded the throne, he had a high reputation in the imperial court. With Mingzhu's assistance, he could easily stabilize the general situation. From the moment they stepped here, the turbulent capital began to calm down. After observing for several days, Li Xian finally confirmed that the incident did not seem to have much effect on Li Yi. Not only that, the entire Li family seemed to be exactly the same as before. Even the servant girl called Xiao Zhu did not seem to feel anything about her mistress's departure. When she brought the wine over, she was smiling like a flower. This made him feel relieved, but also puzzled. Based on his understanding of Li Yi, he could not be so calm at this time. Li Xian looked at him and asked suspiciously, "Did you hide Miss Ruoqing?" Li Yi drank a cup of warm grape wine and shook his head. "No." Li Xian looked at the servant girl who was pouring wine for Li Yi and suddenly said in surprise, "Your servant girl looks unfamiliar. Is she new?" He waved his hand and said, "Don't just look at the marquee. I've run out of wine, why don't you pour it?" "Pour what?" Li Yi slapped the table and glared at him. "If you want to drink, pour it yourself. Don't you have hands?" Li Xian looked at him in a daze, and then looked at the servant girl standing to the side. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a moment, he stared at Li Yi. "You even hid it from me." Li Yi poured more wine for him. "If other people knew, you would be the one in trouble. But you're Ruoqing, is she really the empress of the holy religion?" The dissatisfaction on Li Xian's face instantly disappeared. He asked with some excitement, "Is it like what she said in the letter?" "Correct." Li Yi nodded. "Tell me, is there such a possibility?" Li Xian looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, "Now there are 2 empresses of the holy religion. If we make Taoist none, he made a throat-slitting gesture and murmured, then this holy religion can be used by us. Didn't you say that the holy religion has 100,000 believers in the Qi kingdom? When the time comes, we can work together. That being said, Taoist nun was a grandmaster. Even if she couldn't beat them, she could still run. Moreover, she was in the Qi kingdom, surrounded by followers, and there were many masters among them. If they really fought force with force, the current Lu Meng would not be a match for her. It would not be easy to deal with her. It was slightly more difficult. Li Yi did not accompany Li Xian in his daydreaming. He asked, "How is His Majesty's health?" The winter this year was unusually cold. Chapter 970. His Majesty has just woken up and is talking with Her Highness the Empress and Her Highness the Consort Yan in the hall. Wait in the side hall for a while, Changde said to Li Yi and Li Xian as he closed the door. Li Xian let out a breath and rubbed his hands together. He walked into the side hall and asked, "How many times has father woken up today?" Changde said, "Today is the second time." He woke up for a while in the morning and went back to sleep after eating some food. After walking into the side hall, they could no longer feel the cold air outside. Yongning saw Li Yi and ran over. She accidentally tripped and fell to the ground. Li Yi quickly ran over and picked her up. He asked with concern, "Are you hurt?" Although tears were already welling up in her eyes, she still shook her head and said in a soft voice, "It's not painful." Li Yi patted away the dust on her body and held her little hand. He said, "Be careful when you walk in the future, okay?" Yongning lowered her head and said obediently, "I know." Not only was Yongning in the side hall, but Emingsu and Shaning were also there. There were also a few young princes and princesses playing in the distance. "Teacher, what's wrong with father?" The proud Lolita slowly raised her head and looked at Li Yi. There was a trace of unconcealable panic in the depths of her clear eyes. Li Yi patted her head and said, "His Majesty is fine. He just wants to talk to you. Don't you have many things to say to your father?" Li Yi looked at Emingsu. She was sitting there with a dazed expression and her eyes were out of focus. A eunuch walked in and said softly, "Your Highness the Crown Prince, eldest princess, His Majesty summons you." Li Xian and Emingsu brought Yongning, Shaning, and the group of princes and princesses into the hall. Li Yi sat alone in the side hall, staring blankly at the dancing flames in the furnace. It was quiet in the side hall. Only the crackling sound of the firewood in the stove could be heard. Li Yi's heart was also peaceful. It was so peaceful that he couldn't even hear the only sound. He had already vaguely guessed some things. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps a quarter of an hour, or perhaps an hour, Li Xian's voice rang in his ears. Li Yi looked up at him and realized that Emingsu, Yongning, and Shaning were already standing in front of him. Li Xian's eyes were a little red as he said in a low voice, "Father wants you to go." Li Yi nodded, stood up, and walked out of the side hall. The cold wind blew against his face. He tightened his clothes. Changde had already opened another door and said, "Come in." When Li Yi walked into the hall, the first thing he smelled was a faint fragrance. The fragrance of white fungus and lotus seed soup. He slowly walked to the bed and bowed, "This official greets, cough, no need." A weak voice came from the bed. Emperor Jing leaned on the bed, looked at him, and asked, "Have you eaten?" "Not yet." Li Yi shook his head. It was not time to eat at this time. Emperor Jing tilted his head to look and gestured, "Then eat here." Changde, help Shen up. A bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well, and a few simple side dishes. Although they were simple, it was very intimate. In the early years of Jing He, in Ningguang Fu, there were also these few side dishes and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well. Jin still remember that day when you said that you had a stubborn disease that prevented you from being an official. A eunuch at the side wanted to pick up the spoon for him. Emperor Jing waved his hand with difficulty and picked up the spoon himself. He said, "Why did Jin not punish you for deceiving the emperor at that time?" Li Yi took a sip of the soup and shook his head. He smiled and said, "One who does not know is not guilty. Moreover, if your majesty had deceived the emperor at that time, no one would have saved your majesty that night. Everything is fate." Emperor Jing nodded and said with a smile, "Pour wine for Zhen." Li Yi poured himself a cup of grape wine and shook his head. He said, "Your Majesty, you have forgotten that you cannot drink wine." He took a sip of wine. Emperor Jing suddenly looked at him and asked, "Are you not afraid that the wine is poisoned?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "If your Majesty wanted to poison the wine, why did you wait until today?" Emperor Jing nodded and said, "Yes, if I wanted to poison the wine, after you offered Tianfa, after you used the brothel to spread rumors to force the king of Shu to leave the capital, after you gathered the people in the martial arts world, after you used a play to destroy the literary family of the Jing kingdom, after you got rid of the Cui family, and when you wanted to help Emingzu ascend the throne, would have done it." Li Yi drank the wine in his cup and shook his head. He said, "Tianfa was what your majesty wanted. The king of Shu left the capital was also what your majesty wanted. The one who wanted to destroy the Chu family was your majesty. The one who wanted to get rid of the Cui family and support Emingzu was your majesty. I will not take the blame for this." Emperor Jing looked at him and said slowly, "In the end, you did not let Jin down." Li Yi cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your trust, your majesty." Emperor Jing put down his chopsticks and covered his chest. After a long pause, he said, "Jin will leave soon." His tone was very calm and his expression was indifferent. It was as if he was saying something very ordinary. It was as if he was saying that he would be back soon. Just like just now, he casually asked Li Yi, "Have you eaten?" Li Yi hoped that was the case. Emperor Jing looked at Li Yi and suddenly asked, "You know everything. Can you tell Zhen where people go after they die? Is there really an underworld?" There was no fear on his face, only curiosity. "I don't know whether there is an underworld or not." Li Yi shook his head and said, "But sometimes, death is not the end, but the beginning." "What do you mean?" "It is possible that when your majesty wakes up, you will find that you are no longer in the imperial palace, not in the Jing kingdom, but in the Qi kingdom, in the Wu kingdom, or in another world. At that time, your majesty will not be like this. Perhaps you are just a baby, a naughty child, or a young man." Li Yi looked at Emperor Jing and said, "It seems difficult to understand, but a few years ago, your majesty certainly did not think that anyone could fly to the sky, right?" Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "You mean, fly to the sky like those people in the Academy of Sciences?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "They can only fly a little more than 10 feet, at most a few hundred feet. I said that people can fly thousands of feet, tens of thousands of feet, and even to the moon. At that time, from the capital to the Qi kingdom, it will not take several months, but only 1 to 4 hours. Mere mortals can also fly to the moon. Not only that, but if the sun is not too hot, mortals can even fly to the sun. Your majesty can imagine that in the distant future, celestial punishment can raise the entire capital to the ground, making the capital region barren for 100 years. Your majesty may also not imagine that there is a heavenly eye that allows your majesty to see what is happening in any place in the Jing kingdom from the imperial palace. Your majesty certainly can't imagine that one day, I can send a message to your majesty from the Qi kingdom. There is no courier station, no messenger, and the message arrives in an instant. If your majesty wants to destroy the capital of the Qi kingdom, you don't need to mobilize a large number of people. You only need to sit in the Yangju hall and move your finger." The eunuchs standing on both sides, including Changde, had their mouths wide open. A celestial punishment could destroy the entire capital. Mortals could fly to the moon and see the entire Jing kingdom's heavenly eye. Even from 1,000 miles away, the message arrived in an instant. Did County Marquis Li have a hysteria again? If someone else told me this, I would send him to the Imperial Physician Bureau. Emperor Jing looked at him and said, "You are different. I don't trust others, but I trust you. It's a pity that I won't be able to see this day." He sighed with regret on his face. Then he said, "Changde, call Xian, and Emingzu to come here." Changde walked out of the hole. He turned around and took out a small wine pot from the quilt. He smiled and said, "Shanning understands me the best." He poured a cup of wine for himself. Li Yi did not stop him. Emperor Jing took a sip and closed his eyes. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and said, "After I leave, please take care of Emingzu and Xian, Li Xian and Emingzu walked in. Emperor Jing slowly stood up and held their hands. Then he looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, "I hand over the world to you." Chapter 971. Today was the 15th day of the first lunar month. The capital was getting more and more prosperous every year. It was just past noon, but the streets in the city were already crowded. The Li family. Xiao Huan poked her head out of the kitchen and said, "Young master, I want to eat sesame filling." Second miss also wants to eat sesame filling. The small kitchen was not big to begin with. Li Yi was making yuan shao, Ruoqing was helping by the side, the proud Lolita was helping on the other side, and Yong Ning was running around. The place was a bit crowded. Even if the others wanted to help, they could not come in. Li Yi waved his hand to indicate that he understood. Yong Ning approached Li Yi and said sweetly, "Brother, Cindy wants to eat sugar filling." Li Yi's hands were full of glutinous rice flour. He tapped the tip of her nose and said, "You can only eat 2 sugar filling. If you have cavities, it will be very painful." Yong Ning thought about it and looked up at him. She held out 3 fingers and said, "How about 3? Looking at her pitiful look, Li Yi could only nod. "3 it is, no more, okay." Yong Ning nodded her head forcefully. Worried that Li Yi would go back on his words, she hurriedly ran to Shanning's side and stared with wide eyes. The proud Lolita was holding a small sieve and shaking it. Inside the sieve were yuan shao and glutinous rice flour. The yuan shao shaken this way was round and round. She was never tired of this work. After shaking for a while, she slowly walked over and looked at Li Yi. She said, "Sir, can you make some bean paste filling? I will bring it to father when I return to the palace in the afternoon. Father loves to eat bean paste filling the most." Li Yi smiled at her and said, "Sister Shaoqing is already preparing the filling. We will make it together later." The proud Lolita immediately became happy. Yong Ning walked to her side and looked at the small sieve in her hand. She whispered, "Sister, can I play with this?" Yuan shao was to be eaten in the evening. It was still early. The 15th day of the first lunar month was the busiest day of the year in the capital city. Yong Ning and Shanning spent most of their time in the palace. They had to go back at night, so they couldn't miss this opportunity. After lunch, Li Yi took the 2 of them to the street. Compared to the crowds at night, it was much better during the day because the lantern show, fireworks, and other important events would only start at night. On the street, there were vendors selling all kinds of snacks, street acrobatics, and all kinds of mechanical gadgets. The 2 young ladies could not take it all in. Li Yi looked at the bustling crowd, the row upon row of shops, and the endless stream of hawkers on the street. He deeply felt that in these 2 years, the capital had changed a lot. He bought a sugar figurine for Yong Ning and Shou Ning that represented their zodiac signs and casually asked the old sugar figurine seller, "Sir, how's business today?" The old man grinned and said, "Business is good. In the past, it would take a day to sell, but today, it's all sold out in an hour." Li Yi looked at the sugar figurine in their hands and said with a smile, "Sir, your skill is good. The sugar figurine is so lifelike." It's not surprising that business is good. I think life at home must be good. The old man shook his head and said, "This old man has been selling sugar figurines all his life. It's only in the past 2 years that life has gotten better. If it weren't for His Majesty's compassion for people like us and reducing taxes 3 times, I'm afraid I would have frozen to death at home in the winter of the year before last." The shop assistant at the tea stall next to him curled his lips and said, "Old Zhang, you're still acting pitiful here. This year, a sugar figurine seller built new houses for his 2 sons and married new wives. Next year, your sugar figurine shop will be opening soon. Tell me, what's there to cry about?" The old man frowned and said discontentedly, "This old man has this year because of His Majesty's benevolent policy. It's not like I haven't experienced hard times. But Wang Erxiu, you brat, you got a good policy from the beginning." After the proud Lolita finished eating the sugar figurine, she licked her rosy lips and shook Li Yi's arm. She said, "Sir, I want more." Li Yi looked at Yong Ning on the other side and found that she was also looking at him eagerly. He nodded and looked at the old man selling sugar figurines. He said, "Sir, 2 more please." The old man took out 2 more sugar figurines. When Li Yi paid, he waved his hand and looked at Yong Ning and Shaoning. He said with a smile, "Little girl, you're so handsome. Today is a good day. I'll give these 2 sugar figurines to them." Li Yi handed the sugar figurines to them and said, "Hurry up and thank the old grandpa." "Thank you, old grandpa, thank you, old grandpa," the 2 young girls said obediently. The wrinkles on the old man's face smoothed out like a blooming chrysanthemum. Li Yi held the hands of the 2 young girls and stood on the street. The shouts, peddlers, conversations, and quarrels entered his ears. Together with the images in his eyes, they weaved together to form the embryonic form of a prosperous era. It was a pity that the person who weaved it personally would not be able to see the birth of this prosperous era. It's a pity that His Majesty's health. Sigh, everyone is saying that His Majesty is probably, oh my God, why can't he open his eyes and see? The old man and the shop assistant were still chatting. The proud Lolita bit the sugar figurine in her mouth and lowered her head. She said softly, "Sir, let's go home." Li Yi nodded. He held their hands and walked in the direction they had come from. At the stall, the old man and the shop assistant had finished chatting. He glanced around and saw an extra ingot of silver on the table. He was stunned. When they walked into the courtyard, the proud Lolita suddenly raised her head and looked at him. She said, "Sir, when I return to the palace later, give me a jar of good wine. Father said that your wine is the best." "All right." Li Yi smiled and nodded. Suddenly, he felt a chill at the tip of his nose. He raised his head to look at the sky. Yong Ning's clear voice rang in his ears. "Brother, it's snowing." Dong! A deep bell rang from a certain direction. Once, twice, the sound came from the east. One after another, it resounded throughout the capital. At the entrance of a certain brothel in the capital. "Who's ringing the bell in broad daylight?" A burly man mumbled in confusion. He saw the middle-aged man beside him suddenly stop in his tracks and turn to walk outside. He asked doubtfully, "Fifth Lord, what's wrong? Aren't you going to watch the show?" The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. "I'm afraid we won't be able to watch the show today. Let's go back." The noisy streets of the capital gradually quietened down as the bell rang. Someone asked, "How many times did the bell ring?" 45. 45. The bell rang 45 times. It was the sound of a great funeral. A man faced the east and slowly knelt down. Beside him, a second man faced the east and followed suit. 3 people, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, all the officials in the capital, regardless of rank or status, walked out of the guard room and walked to the courtyard. They faced the east and knelt down. At the palace gate, the imperial guards put down their weapons and slowly knelt down. At this moment, only the echoing bell rang in the entire capital. In the Li family, the imperial guard kneeling on the ground stood up and walked to Shaning and Yongning. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, it's time to return to the palace. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the Lantern Festival. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, when the first snowflake of this winter landed on Li Yi's nose, it snowed continuously in 13 provinces of the Jing kingdom. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the emperor collapsed." Chapter 972. There was no snow in the winter of the 4th year of Jinghe. At the beginning of the 5th year of Jinghe, it was the Lantern Festival, and the snowflakes in the capital were as heavy as a mat. Li Yi stood in the courtyard, and the bells seemed to be echoing in his ears. The snowflakes fell one after another, and in just a quarter of an hour, there was a snowman in the courtyard. Rui held an umbrella and stood quietly by his side. Drunken Mo and Ruoqing came over and looked at him with worry. Son-in-law. Tears fell from Xiao Huan's eyes, and she helped Li Yi sweep the snowflakes off his shoulders and head. Mississippi Lu strode over, carried him on her shoulder, and walked briskly back to the room. She reached out to seal his acupoints, roughly took off his coat, and threw him on the bed, covering him with a thick quilt. She turned and closed the door in one go. The emperor had fallen, and the country was in mourning. The officials and nobles in the capital, regardless of their official position, were required to fast for 3 days. Within 27 days, the soldiers and civilians in the capital were required to take off their ornaments and wear plain clothes. Marriage was not allowed within a month, slaughter was not allowed within 49 days, and pleasure was not allowed within 100 days. From the day of mourning in the capital, all temples and monasteries rang 30,000 times. In the 5th year of Jinghe, there was only the 15th of the first month, and no lantern festival. The whole country mourned. The next time Li Yi saw Li Xian alone, it was already 7 days later. His clothes were still gorgeous, but his appearance was very haggard, his lips were chapped, and his beard was unshaven. Of course, Li Yi himself was not much better than him. In these 7 days, except for the ceremony that he needed to attend, he spent most of his time in bed. After sleeping for a long time, he had a headache, and it had not subsided until now. Mingzu was much better than the two of them, but her eyes were dull and she looked a little haggard. The late emperor had passed away, and Li Xian was in charge of the funeral. She still needed to stabilize the affairs of the court. 2 days ago, concubine Cui hanged herself in Yeding. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the ground, and his voice was hoarse. Before she died, she shouted that she did not do anything wrong to your majesty, and that she would go down to accompany you. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you feel that the palace is much more deserted than before?" "This palace has always been deserted." Li Yi shook his head and murmured. Li Xian sighed, "I really don't like this place." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "When will you be enthroned?" The country could not go a day without a ruler. The Jing kingdom was surrounded by enemies. The news of His Majesty's death would soon spread throughout the world. At that time, it was unknown what Qi and Zhao would do. Within a month, a new ruler had to ascend the throne to stabilize the situation. Let's wait for another month. Li Xian waved his hand. "I want to spend more time with my father. I haven't spent much time with him before." He turned to look at Mingzu and said, "I'll have to trouble Mingzu with the affairs of the court." As Li Yi walked out of the hall, a figure was about to enter. "Teacher," Li Han looked up at him and said in a low voice. Li Yi didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that Li Han was thinner than the last time he saw him. Li Yi patted him on the shoulder and raised his head to look around. Under the gray sky, the entire palace was filled with eunuchs and palace maids dressed in silk morning dresses and hurrying about with their heads lowered. It was indeed much more deserted than before. He didn't leave the palace directly, but walked in another direction. This was the imperial harem, and without the emperor's decree, foreign officials were not allowed to enter. But there was an exception. In front of a palace maid bowed respectfully and said, "Marquis Li, please wait a moment. I'll go inform her ladyship." Li nodded and stood in front of the palace gate. Not long after, the palace maid came out and said, "Marquis Li, please come in." Li walked into this slightly smaller palace and bowed slightly to a woman in palace robes sitting on a couch. "Greetings, her ladyship Yen." "Lord Li, no need to be so polite." There was a trace of tiredness between concubine Yan's brows. She held her forehead and pointed in a direction, saying, "They're both in their rooms. It's good for you to go see." Li passed through a side door, and palace maids and eunuchs kept bowing to him. In front of a room, a palace maid said in a low voice, "Their highnesses haven't been sleeping well these past few days. They've just fallen asleep." "It's fine." Li gently pushed open the door and slowly closed it. On a large bed in the room, two figures, one big and one small, were hugging each other. Even in their dreams, their brows were tightly furrowed. Li walked to the side of the bed. His footsteps were very light and silent. The proud Lolita suddenly woke up from her dream. After seeing him, she was startled, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She was wearing Hello Kitty pajamas and threw herself into Li Yi's arms. Tears flowed out of her eyes as she choked, "Sir, Father Emperor is gone. I'm so scared." Her voice woke Yongning up. Yongning, who was wearing sheep pajamas, crawled out of the bed. Her eyes were slightly panicked, and she grabbed Shanning with one hand and Li Yi with the other, not letting go. Li Yi sat on the side of the bed and held them in his arms. He whispered, "With Sir here, don't be afraid." He looked at the dark room and the tear-stained face in his arms. He helped her wipe away her tears and said, "Hurry up and put on your clothes. Sir will take you out of the palace." "Really?" The proud Lolita raised her head to look at him, and there were still traces of tears on her face. "Really?" Li nodded. The proud Lolita left Li Yi's arms, lowered her head, and whispered, Then, sir, please turn around. I'm going to change." Not long after, Li Yi walked out holding the hands of the two girls. Concubine Yen stood up and slowly said, "Take them out of the palace. This is not a place for them to stay." Li Yi nodded, looked at her, and said, "Thank you, Concubine Yen." Concubine Yen waved her hand and walked into the depths of the palace. Taking Shanning and Yongning out of the palace only required Concubine Yan's permission and a word from Li Xian. Concubine Yen did not have any objections. Li Yi asked a eunuch to bring a message to Li Xian, and then he took them out of the palace. When he walked out of the palace, he looked back. Thick, dark clouds gathered above the palaces, and the pressure made it hard for people to breathe. Concubine Yen was right. This deep palace was indeed not a place for them to stay. Birth, old age, sickness, and death. This was a law that no one could escape. Heaven was unfair. Some people were born to be beggars, and some were born to be emperors. Heaven was also fair. No matter beggars or emperors, they could not escape death in the end. Heaven was impartial. The former emperor was loved and remembered by the people for his benevolent policies. During his reign, he carried out several reforms, improved the people's livelihood, supported the poor, adjusted the tax laws, and reorganized military discipline. He personally created a golden age that had never been seen since the founding of the Jing kingdom. Now that the former emperor had passed away, the golden age had ended, and the whole country was grieving. In a month, the new emperor would be enthroned, and that would be the beginning of a golden age. A new golden age. Foreign Affairs, Chapter of Emperor Jing. On the 15th day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jinghe, it snowed continuously in 13 states of the capital region, and the emperor passed away in the Hall of Healing. At the entrance of the emergency room of Shijing City Central Hospital, China. A little girl of about 5 or 6 years old had tears in her eyes. She held a woman's hand and sobbed, "Mom, I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, Dad wouldn't have died." The woman squatted down and gently wiped the tears from her eyes. She said, "Xiao Yi, don't cry. It's not your fault." The door of the emergency room suddenly opened, and a few doctors in white coats came out. The beautiful woman immediately stood up and asked with a worried face, "Doctor, how is he? He's out of danger for the time being." The doctor walking in front said, then shook his head and said, "The patient's head was hit, and he's still in a coma. If he can wake up within 24 hours, he'll be fine." "If he doesn't wake up," the woman asked in a trembling voice, "what if he doesn't wake up?" "Please be mentally prepared," the doctor said. The doctor said, and the woman fell back to her seat. "Dad, wake up quickly. Xiao Yi doesn't want to eat cotton candy. Xiao Yi wants Dad to wake up." In the ward, a pale man was lying on the bed. The little girl held his hand and whispered. The woman pushed the door open and came in. She squatted down and picked her up. She said, "Xiao Yi, get ready to go to school." "Xiao Yi doesn't want to go to school. Xiao Yi wants Dad to wake up." The little girl shook her head and said stubbornly, "Dad has been sleeping for a month. Why hasn't he woken up yet? Adults can't stay in bed." The woman turned her face away so that the child wouldn't see her tears fall. She took a deep breath and said, "Xiao Yi, Dad will sleep for a long time." "Mom, you're lying." The little girl raised her head and looked at her stubbornly. She said, "I saw Dad's fingers move just now. He's going to wake up soon." "Xiao Yi." The woman's face sank for the first time. Seeing the tears in the little girl's eyes, she could only sigh and pick her up. She said softly, "Xiao Yi, let's go to school, okay?" The little girl choked and said, "Mom, Xiao Yi didn't lie. Dad's fingers really moved." The woman closed her eyes and looked at the man on the sickbed for a long time. Then she turned around and walked out of the ward with the child in her arms. "Where is this place? Who are you?" As she stepped out of the ward, a weak voice suddenly came from behind her. She turned her head in disbelief and looked at the man sitting on the sickbed. The man on the sickbed looked at her with the same disbelief and unconcealable surprise. He blurted out, "Liang Fei. Dad." The little girl broke free from her mother's arms and ran to the sickbed, throwing herself into the man's arms. "Xiao Yi, be careful." The woman's face changed and she hurried over. "Yongning." The man looked at the little girl in his arms and murmured. His face suddenly showed a painful expression. He grabbed his head and growled in his throat. The woman's face changed greatly and she asked, "What's wrong with you? Where are you feeling uncomfortable?" Doctor." After a while, the man put his hand down from his head. He looked at the woman and shook his head. He said, I'm fine." "How can you be fine?" The woman's face became more anxious. She said, "Check again." "I'm really fine." The man got off the sickbed and held the little girl in his arms. He took a deep breath and said with a smile, "I haven't felt this good in a long time. So that brat didn't lie to me." He murmured in a low voice and looked at a small box in the ward. There was a figure moving inside. "Is this television? Are you really fine?" The woman looked at him suspiciously. The man looked at her and said with a smile, "I'm really fine. If you're fine." The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at him. She asked, "Li Hong, tell me, which little vixen is Liang Fei?" Unbelievable, this kind of thing can actually happen. Miracle, it's really a miracle. In the hospital, a group of old men held examination reports in their hands and surrounded a middle-aged man, clicking their tongues in wonder. Facing the director of the central hospital and more than 10 leading doctors in the medical world, the man's expression was calm. He asked with a smile, "Can we go now?" An old man looked at him from head to toe for a while before nodding. "You can go after signing this piece of paper. However, to be on the safe side, come back for a follow-up in a week." The man took the ballpoint pen from him. After looking at it in his hand, he frowned. He glanced around and caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the office. He strode over. When everyone saw this, they all looked over. He picked up a writing brush, dipped it in ink, and wrote down his name. Good writing. At that moment, an old man's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at him and asked, "May I know which leading master in the calligraphy world is this gentleman's teacher?" Li. After smiling, the man picked up the little girl with one hand and the woman with the other, and strode away. Li. The old man stroked his beard and said doubtfully, "I've never heard of him." Walking out of the hospital, the man looked at the towering buildings and the iron shells shuttling on the streets. His face showed shock. "When did you learn to write with a brush?" The woman turned her head and looked at him in surprise. She asked, "Why didn't I know?" The man smiled and said, "A long time ago." When the woman was about to speak, the mobile phone in her pocket suddenly rang. The man looked at the mobile phone in her hand in a daze and murmured, "Voice from 1,000 miles away." The woman smiled and answered the phone. She said, "Mom." "Yes, he's already awake. We've checked him and there's no problem. We'll be back soon." After hanging up the phone, she found that the man had been looking at her. She blushed slightly and said angrily, "Why are you looking at me?" The man smiled and said, "Because you're good-looking. Don't be serious." The woman glared at him and said, "Are you hungry? Let's go eat first." The man shook his head and said, "I want to go to the library first." The woman looked at him and asked uncertainly, "Now?" The man nodded and said, "Now. Well, the provincial library is only 2 stops away from here." The woman nodded and said, "You've just been discharged from the hospital. It's appropriate for you to exercise. Let's walk." As soon as she finished speaking, a panicked voice suddenly came from the hospital. "Catch the thief! Catch the thief!" A figure ran out of the hospital in a panic. When he passed by the man, he suddenly stopped. It was not because he felt guilty and wanted to repent, but because a hand like an iron clamp grabbed his wrist. "You're courting death." He was shocked and angry. He pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed the man's waist. "No!" The woman only had time to let out a scream. The dagger in the thief's hand fell into the man's hand. The man held the little girl in one hand and threw the dagger aside. He looked at the thief and said coldly, "How dare you?" The thief looked at him and felt an oppressive momentum. Suddenly, a burst of fear came from the bottom of his heart. His back was soaked with cold sweat. His legs gave way and he fell to the ground. "Wow! Dad is so powerful." The little girl put her arms around the man's neck. Her eyes were full of little stars. She kissed him hard on the face. The woman next to him also looked at him in disbelief. Her beautiful eyes were full of splendor. The hospital security guards rushed out and restrained the thief. A young woman ran out and bowed to the man. "My ID card and bank card are in the bag." "Thank you so much." The man looked at her miniskirt and revealed a small part of her chest. He frowned and said, "You're naked in broad daylight." "What a scandal." The young woman looked up at him and said, "You." The man shook his head. "As a woman, how can you be so shameless? You're crazy." The young woman glared at him and hurried away in high heels. A moment later, in the sightseeing elevator of the provincial library, The man looked at the gradually shrinking figure below and smiled. Why did you have to come to the library? Walking out of the elevator, the woman shook her head and said, What books do you want to buy? I'll go buy them. You and Xiao Yi sit here for a while. The man shook his head and said, Just walk around here. I'll go back in a while. Next to a bookshelf, the man picked up a book and murmured, Apollo Program, Amsterdam, Moon Landing, Universe, Black Hole, Interstellar Travel, TNT, Atomic Bomb, Hydrogen Bomb. He walked to another place and picked up a newspaper. iPhone 10 production stopped. Zhang Jingkong announced marriage. The woman walked to his side and asked in confusion, What are you talking about? Nothing. The man smiled and closed his eyes. He quickly opened them and said, Let's go home. You're not buying books. Not anymore. The man nodded. He carried the little girl and held the woman's hand. When they walked to the elevator, he glanced at the rest area and suddenly stopped in his tracks. The woman turned around and looked at him. What's wrong? I met a friend. The man put the little girl down and said, Xiao Yi and Mom stay here for a while. Dad will be there soon. He walked to the rest area and walked to the side of a young man. He pointed at the computer on the table and asked with a smile, Young man, can I borrow your computer for a while? The young man raised his head and nodded sleepily. He made way for the man. The man sat down and opened the browser. He typed the words Jing Kingdom in the search box and clicked on Search, the way of Confucianism, the unfettered scholar. The man clicked on a few web pages, shook his head, and closed them. Thank you. What's your name? He smiled and extended his hand. The young man was stunned. He shook his hand and said, Li Yi. Nice to meet you. The man smiled at him. The young man nodded and turned around to sit down. The man raised his leg and kicked the young man's butt. The young man lay on the ground in a very indecent position. How dare you flirt with my daughter? I'll collect some interest first. The man glared at him fiercely and turned around to leave. The young man got up from the ground in shock. He stared blankly at the elegant man in a suit as he left. He cursed in his heart. He just came to the library to take a nap, but he actually met a lunatic at the door of the elevator. The middle-aged man picked up the little girl and held the woman's hand. He smiled and said, Let's go home. The little girl looked at him and asked worriedly, Dad won't sleep again, right? The man touched her head and said with a smile, He won't. The woman beside him glanced at him and said, I'll let you go for now. Tell me honestly who Liang Fei is when we go back. Chapter 973. It was already the 3rd month of the 5th year of Jinghe. In the 3rd month of spring, the grass was long and the orioles were flying. It was the season of recovery. The green willows in the hibiscus garden had already sprouted new buds, and the apricot forest was filled with a delicate fragrance. The blue water rippled in the breeze, and a girl's voice was crisp and sweet. Sir, come and see, I caught a big fish. Li Yi walked over and helped Shanning take the fish off the hook. At the age of 14, the girl's face had lost most of its immaturity. When she raised her head and smiled, it seemed that the spring scenery in the garden was a lot brighter. A guard took the fat fish, skillfully cut open its belly, removed the scales, and handed it to Prince Jean, Li Han, who was next to the grill. Li Han, who was close to 13 years old and could roast fish well, was already the official dean of the academy. His originally chubby face had started to become more angular. At this time, it had been more than half a month since Li Xian ascended the throne at the beginning of March. The former emperor, Renzong, died at the beginning of the year. Jinghe's reign ended in the 5th year, but to establish a new era, it would have to wait until next year. Just like the late spring, in the 3rd month of spring, the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom began to exude vitality. The court was running steadily, the people lived and worked in peace and contentment, the public security was good, and the economy was booming. Of course, these had nothing to do with the unreliable emperor. Li Xian was using a microscope to observe the microorganisms in the lake. Things made with glass were no longer much of a challenge for the Academy of Sciences. They had already made presbyopic glasses, which could be said to be a blessing for some old ministers in the court. It was said that after an old imperial censor's presbyopia was cured, he didn't say a word about Li Xian wanting to increase research funds for the Academy of Sciences. Li Xian, the bastard emperor, was so lazy that when he presided over the funeral of the late emperor, he entrusted all the affairs of the court to his assistant, Mingzu. After he ascended to the throne, he seemed to have completely forgotten about this matter. At first, he did not forget to attend the court every day, but he only persisted for 10 days before handing over all the affairs of the court to Mingzu with the excuse that he was busy with his research. The officials had nothing to say. After going through so many things, they understood that the Jing kingdom could not live without a princess, nor could it live without His Majesty. Such an arrangement seemed absurd, but it was the most suitable one. Li Yi held Yongning's hand and walked towards the lawn with Shanning by his side. Two small figures walked and crawled on the lawn. Occasionally, they would lose their balance and fall. Rui and Crown Princess. Now they should be called the Empress. Rui and the Empress had told the maids and guards around them to let them play by themselves. After falling and beating, the bodies of the children, who were almost 1.5 years old, would become stronger. From the 4th year to the 5th year of Jing He, among the officials and nobles in the capital, the Wang family was undoubtedly the biggest winner. In the beginning, many people thought that the Wang family was destroying the foundation of the family by marrying the crown prince instead of the king of Shu, who was favored by the officials. Now, those people had to rely on the Wang family to survive. They had the most powerful financial resources in the Jing kingdom and were backed by the most powerful forces in the Jing kingdom. Who could compete with the Wang family? If there was only one family. In terms of financial resources, ordinary people would naturally think of the god of wealth's family in the Jing kingdom. However, a small number of people knew that the Li family's financial resources were not far from the Wang family's, or even surpassed it, in terms of power. Although the Wang family had the empress, they still couldn't compare with the favored officials of the two dynasties. The Wang family didn't need to compare either, because the Wang family and the Li family had a special relationship. Yongning and Shanning ran to play with Li Duan and Li Rui. Li Yi walked to Rui and Wang Qin and bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." Wang Qin smiled and said, "Sister Rui and I are like sisters. County Marquis Li, you don't have to be so polite." Although Li Xian was the emperor, there was only one empress in the harem. Many officials in the court had repeatedly written to him, asking him to appoint concubines, but to no avail. This was also the reason why the Wang family's position in the court was becoming more and more stable. If the emperor didn't appoint a new concubine, there was no suspense about who would be the next emperor. Li Han came over with a plate and said, "Sir, the fish is grilled. I didn't put too much seasoning on it." Li Han's grilling technique had been unanimously approved by everyone, so Prince Jean was also a part-time grill hand in addition to being the dean of the academy. Rui liked to eat lightly flavored food, so Li Yi asked him to put less seasoning. The empress' taste should be similar. She didn't have many friends in the palace, so she often called Rui to the palace. Li Xian later directly moved his family to Furong Garden. Anyway, there were only 2 people in his family. This place wasn't far from the Li family, so he and Rui often visited each other. Ladies first. There were many fish bones in the lake. Li Yi used chopsticks to pick out the bones, then handed the plate to Rui and walked towards Li Xian by the lake. Wang Qin sighed softly and said, "When father was alive, his favorite people were my husband, Mingzu, and County Marquis Li. Father's death was a great blow to them, Rui smiled and said, "My husband often said that death is not the end. Maybe the former emperor just went to another world." The former emperor was the emperor, a dragon among men. Even in another world, he could live very well. I believe that His Majesty and Her Royal Highness also think so. You have an undeserved reputation as the Dean of the Academy of Mathematics. All the matters of the Academy are done by Xiao Han. It's just a title, and there's no need to trouble you. Why do you want to resign? Li Xian withdrew his gaze from the microscope and looked at him. Opportunities should always be left to young people. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Xiao Han has been coveting that position for a long time. As a teacher, I naturally have to fulfill his wish." Li Xian did not continue this topic. He thought of something and suddenly said, "I almost forgot that you are only a county marquis now. How about I make you a county magistrate?" "Forget it, how about a duke?" Since the founding of the country, no duke had been conferred, not even a county magistrate. His title of county marquis had been an exception for decades. Li Yi looked at Li Xian and asked, "Why don't you make me a prince?" "You want to be a prince?" Li Xian thought for a while and said, "If you want to be a prince, I'll write an edict when I go back." If Li Xian really issued this edict, there might be a courtier who would kill himself tomorrow. For the sake of his own reputation, Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Forget it. A county marquis is good. His Majesty is gone, and there's no point in being a duke or a prince." He looked at Li Xian and said, "You can't throw all the matters of court politics to Mingzhu. You are the emperor, and you are also a man. Can't you act like a man and shoulder the responsibilities you should bear?" Li Xian looked at him and asked, "What's wrong? Do you feel sorry for her?" "If you feel sorry for her, you can help her yourself." Li Xian glanced at him and said, "You and Mingzhu can solve any problem if you work together." Li Yi took a deep breath and asked, "Are you the emperor or am I the emperor?" Li Xian asked back, "Do you like Mingzhu or do I like Mingzhu?" Li Yi was defeated again. "However, you are right about one thing." Li Xian thought for a while and suddenly said, "Since you are a man, you should bear the responsibility that a man should have." Li Yi nodded. This guy was somewhat responsible. Li Xian looked in a certain direction and murmured, "Little Han is already 13 years old. In another 2 years, he will be a man, right?" Somewhere by the lake, Li Han, who was roasting fish, suddenly had goosebumps and his body couldn't help but tremble. Chapter 974. In a feudal society where imperial power was supreme, the throne was the most dignified and supreme thing. Li Xian's way of thinking, which was like kicking the throne around like a ball, was very different from the ancient people. Li Yi felt deeply guilty. Thinking about how Li Yi was obsessed with mental arithmetic and was exactly the same as him, as his teacher, Li Yi felt that his sins were even deeper. Li Xian was still young, and his thoughts were too idealistic and unrealistic. In 2 years, he would understand that the throne wasn't something he could give up just because he wanted to, and he could give it to whoever he wanted. Li Han could be a good head of the Arithmetic Academy, and he could be a cook, but it was unlikely that he could be a good emperor. At least, this was what Li Yi thought when he ate the fish he roasted. After handing over the fish with the bones removed to Yongning and Shaoning, Li Han walked over and looked at Li Xian in the distance. He asked hesitantly, "Teacher, what were you talking about with my brother?" Li Yi picked up a piece of fish and asked, "What's wrong?" Li Han shook his head and said, "Nothing. It's just that I have a bad feeling." Children nowadays had a strong desire to live. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head, saying, "We didn't talk about much. Don't think too much, go roast another fish." Furong Garden had a quiet environment and pleasant scenery. Other than Xiujiang Gardens, it was one of the 2 most beautiful imperial gardens in the capital. The Li family wasn't far from these 2 places. When he and Rui went home, they didn't even need to take a carriage. Li Yi carried the already asleep Li Duan. Rui tilted her head and looked at him, asking, "Husband, do you feel that Dwayne really likes Xiao Rui?" Such a young child actually didn't know whether he liked or not. It was just that the two children had played together for a long time and were used to it. If it was a kitten or a puppy, he would still like it. Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Did Her Majesty and Nyangzi say something?" Rui smiled and nodded. She said that Dwayne and Xiao Rui were born on the same day. It's fate from their previous lives. If they can grow up together like this, they can be considered childhood sweethearts. Why don't we settle the marriage now? Because of his own experience, Li Yi abhorred things like arranged marriages or child betrothal. He shook his head and said, "Their affairs will depend on themselves in the future. We'd better not interfere too much." Rui obviously liked Xiao Rui very much. She thought for a moment and said, "But Xiao Rui is a princess. When the time comes, many people will want to marry into the royal family. If the Dwayner likes her and she is betrothed to someone else, then let's snatch." Li Yi said without hesitation, "My wife is the best at snatching people." Rui took Li Duan from his arms and said lightly, "I have something to discuss with Sister Zuemo. Husband, sleep in the study tonight." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Don't. If there's anything to discuss, let's go together." Rui looked at him and asked, "Sister Zuemo and I are going to discuss all night. Does husband want to join us? If you don't mind." Li Yi looked at the smile on Rui's face, waved his hand, and said, "Forget it. That bed is too small for 3 people." He had originally planned to marry Zuemo at the beginning of the year, but because of the death of the former emperor, he could only postpone the date. Now, although a month had passed, there was no auspicious date in a short period of time. Of course, the more important reason was that he thought that the time between the two events was too short, and he felt uneasy. He was gratified that Zuemo could understand this and even comforted him. How lucky he was in this life to be able to meet these women. Thinking about it, this might also be God's compensation for his previous life. After all, he went to the library with the intention of learning. Not only did he meet a psychopath who returned kindness with ingratitude, but he also encountered an incredible fire. God owed him too much. At the gate of the Li mansion, Li Yi unexpectedly saw a person. The gatekeeper of the Li family said politely to a young man, "Sir, my master and madam have gone out. I don't know when they will be back. Why don't you come again tomorrow, or wait in the mansion?" The young man cupped his hands and said, "In that case, I will come again another day." "No need for another day." Li Yi walked over, patted Jiang Zian on the shoulder, and said with a smile, "Brother Jiang, what's the matter? Let's talk inside." The expression on Jiang Zian's face immediately became respectful, lordly. In the mansion, the maids served good tea. Li Yi looked at Jiang Zian and asked with a smile, "Brother Zian should be leaving soon, right?" "Yes, the appointment from the Ministry of Personnel has been issued. I will leave tomorrow." Jiang Zian nodded and suddenly stood up. He bowed deeply to Li Yi and said, "Jiang Zian thanks Lordly for saving my life." His former friend had almost pushed him into the abyss. His former enemy had not only saved him from prison, but had also given him a bright career. At this moment, standing in front of Li Yi, his heart was in turmoil, and he could not control himself. Li Yi stood up and helped him up. He said, "Brother Jiang, please be careful on this trip to Qing'an Prefecture. Anxi County is also your hometown. You must govern it well in the future. Don't let your people down." Jiang Zian's expression was solemn. He bowed and said, "Zian will not let Lordly down." Li Yi smiled and said, "You don't have to be so polite. Sit." After Jiang Zian sat down, he cupped his hands again and said, "I have offended you in the past. Lordly, please forgive me." I don't mention the past." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "How can there be no wine when old friends gather? Servants, bring wine." The Li family's cooks were very fast. In a quarter of an hour, a jar of wine and a few dishes were served. Li had once made up his mind to never drink again, but he did not persist for long. During this time, he had failed to compete with Mississippi Liu and Emingzu in terms of drinking, but his tolerance for alcohol had greatly improved. Jiang Ziyan was very restrained at first, but after a few cups of wine, he gradually became intoxicated. Lordly, brotherly, do you really think of me as a friend? Of course. I, Li Yi, don't have many friends. You, Jiang Ziyan, are one of them. Don't forget, we are friends who have been through life and death together. Since we are friends, there are some things that I have to say. Jiang Ziyan's eyes were hazy from the alcohol. He looked at him discontentedly and said, Miss Ruoqing is such a good woman. Even if she is the empress, don't you want to find her? You scolded those Jinsher in Prince Ning mansion, where is your courage? Li Yi slapped him on the head and scolded, at this time, you still dare to think about my Ruoqing? I don't think about her. Jiang Ziyan's face turned red. He stared at him and said, I just feel that what you did was not like a man. I am not like a man. Li Yi looked at Jiang Ziyan and took the woman who was pouring wine for him into his arms. He said, Ruoqing, tell him, do I look like a man? Jiang Ziyan was shocked. Ah, you are Miss Ruoqing. At the door, hearing the man's hearty laughter coming from the room, drunken Mo lowered her head, and a trace of sadness appeared in her eyes. Although he was laughing, it did not mean that he was really happy. If he was really happy, he would not have to drink. If he was not happy, it would be difficult for her to smile. Rui walked to her side, glanced into the room, and whispered, after the former emperor left, my husband did not have many enemies, nor did he have many friends. He once said that after the former emperor left, no one could shelter them from the wind and rain. Drunken Mo looked at the figure in the room and shook her head. Now in the capital, who can set off a storm? They respect him, and fear him. He actually does not like this. Rui took her hand and shook her head. There is only one side of my husband that we do not understand. Jiang Ziyan was soon drunk and was helped to the guest room by the servants of the Li family to rest. Li Yi leaned against the chair and rested for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he saw an old face full of wrinkles. Since the death of the emperor, he had not seen this old face for a long time. Li Yi's expression didn't change as he asked, what else? When you leave, take Yongning with you. She can't live without you. Li Yi nodded. These were two souls that were connected to each other. Not only could Yongning not live without him, he could not live without Yongning either. He looked at Changde and continued to ask, anything else? Don't hurt Shaoning. She's still a child who doesn't understand anything. Changde put down his wine cup and said, when she truly understands these things, let her make her own decision. Li Yi looked at him and asked, understand what? Changde shook his head and said, I'm just passing on His Majesty's words to you. Li Yi thought about it and nodded. Okay. After the death of the former emperor, Chief Eunuch Changde guarded the imperial mausoleum for a year. During this year, he didn't leave the mausoleum at all. As someone who had followed the former emperor his entire life, no one understood the former emperor better than him, and no one knew what he wanted to do better than him. When he saw Changde out of the Li residence, he ran into the slovenly old man. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li Yi understood that reaching the peak in any field was not by chance, but by necessity. Before getting to know the slovenly old man, the most diligent person he had seen was Yang Liuqing, followed by Mississippi Liu. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li Yi finally understood how he had reached the Grandmaster realm. He was already so old, but he was still working so hard. If he didn't become a Grandmaster, there would be no justice in this world. However, being a master was lonely. As a Grandmaster, only Grandmasters could be his opponent. Rui was a grandmaster, but she wouldn't spar with the slovenly old man. Taoist Nun was also a grandmaster, but she was thousands of miles away. There were also grandmasters nearby. Li Yi still didn't know what realm's second great uncle was at, but he was definitely strong enough to be a match for the slovenly old man. Unfortunately, he wasn't so lonely in front of second great uncle. Of course, the closest grandmaster was old man Chang in front of him. The two were about the same age, and their realms were similar. They were indeed excellent opponents. The slovenly old man walked past them, paused, and quickly walked back, looking at Changde. At this moment, Li Yi actually saw some kind of inexplicable light in his eyes. Fight? The slovenly old man looked at Changde and suddenly said. Old man Chang maintained his usual aloof manner, glanced at him indifferently, and walked out of the door. The slovenly old man smiled disdainfully. You don't dare. This kind of clumsy provocation naturally had no effect on old man Chang, who was familiar with all kinds of tricks in the palace. Changde's footsteps were very steady, and he was about to step out of the door. The slovenly old man said angrily, You sly old man, has the courage of a grandmaster been eaten by a dog? Changde paused, but the next moment, he still walked out of the door without hesitation. The slovenly old man thought for a moment and said calmly, You don't have a dick. Li Yi suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Then, he heard a familiar, cold voice. Since you want to die, I'll fulfill your wish. He ran inside, shouting as he ran, Rui, Rui, come out and watch the show. Mississippi Lu was in the room, writing at the desk. She was probably dealing with Lu Meng's matter. The current her was becoming more and more like a qualified chief of Wulin. What's the matter? She looked up at Li Yi, who had suddenly barged in, and asked. There's no time to explain. Let's go out first. Li Yi grabbed her arm and ran outside. A battle between grandmasters was not something that could be seen every day, especially when grandmasters fought with their lives on the line. Mississippi Lu was only one step away from this realm. After watching it, she might have some feelings. There was no need for Li Yi to explain it all. Mississippi Lu was pulled out of the door by him. When she saw the two vague figures outside, she had already stopped and could not look away. Li Yi only saw two shadows, and could not help but ask curiously, How is it? Who has the upper hand now? Don't talk. Mississippi Lu reached out to cover his mouth. Li Yi moved her hand away and smelled a familiar fragrance. He spat a few times, and then looked at the field again. Old man Chang might really be fighting with his life this time. He fought from the ground to the top of the wall, from the top of the wall to the sky, and finally from the sky to the ground. Li Yi could not see their moves clearly. After about a quarter of an hour, there was a loud bang. The two figures separated and stood on one side of the wall. It felt like the battle between Shimin Chueshua and Yi Guqing. Awesome. I haven't fought so happily for a long time. The sloppy old man laughed and said, I can't beat you, and you can't beat me. Let's call it a draw today. Let's fight another day. What do you think? Changde's fists, which were hidden in his sleeves, trembled slightly. He looked at him coldly and jumped off the wall. Without saying anything, he turned around and left. Seeing him leave, an unnatural flush appeared on the sloppy old man's face. He jumped down from the top of the wall and muttered, This old thing is worthy of being from the palace. If it wasn't for the fact that he has made some progress these days, he would have lost face today. Mississippi Lu stood where she was, deep in thought. Li Yi looked at her, walked to the sloppy old man, and asked, Sue, how difficult is it to break through the bottleneck of supreme power? Do you have any experience? It's difficult, but it's not difficult either. The sloppy old man looked back at Mississippi. Luan said, some people find it difficult in their bodies, while others find it difficult in their hearts. Let go of your obsession and worries, and only then can you pass the barrier of your heart. After saying that, he strode inside. Li followed closely and asked curiously, what do you mean? Those who should understand will understand as soon as they hear it, and it's useless for those who shouldn't understand to say it. The sloppy old man smiled and said, whether or not your clan's second miss and that little princess can take that step in this lifetime will depend on whether or not they can overcome the barrier of their hearts. What stubbornness, worry, or lack thereof? Instead of advising others to practice diligently, what idealism was this? Li looked at the sloppy old man and suddenly asked, so, Elder Su has also once let go of his stubbornness and worries. The sloppy old man stopped, and a complicated expression appeared on his face, but he did not answer. Li thought for a moment and said, I have one last question. Yes. The sloppy old man's figure disappeared, leaving only a long sigh. Chapter 976. Who do you love? Li looked at the empty courtyard and asked in confusion. He just wanted to ask the sloppy old man what his chances of becoming a grandmaster were. After all, if Rui and Emingzu were blocked at the door of grandmaster status and couldn't take that step, he still had a chance to catch up and restore his manhood. Who did he say he loved? Changde. He had heard of friendship forged by fighting, but he had never heard of gay love forged by fighting. Could it be that the two of them had fallen in love with each other and developed into a gay relationship? Hearing a voice coming from behind, Li looked back and saw the old woman standing at the door looking at him. Come in with me for a moment. The old woman turned and walked into the room. Li didn't hesitate and followed. The old woman had always been very concerned about the Li family. This time, she had set the date and written all the invitations. All she had to do was wait to send them out, but it was a national funeral. She felt a bit regretful. After the 1-month deadline, she mentioned it to him twice in a vague way, but he deliberately avoided it. It seemed that he couldn't wait any longer. The old woman put away the wine jars in the room and said, the previous emperor treated you and the Li family well when he was alive. You should be grieving when the previous emperor passed away. But the dead are gone, and the living must live on well. You still have Rui, Zumo, and Dwainer. You shouldn't be overly sad. Li smiled and nodded. I know. In the beginning, his mood was indeed gloomy for a long time. That was because ever since they first met in Qing and Fu, there had been no relationship between the ruler and his official. They were ruler and official, and they were also friends. Even though he had always been mentally prepared, when the day really came, it was still difficult to accept. But just as the old woman said, the dead were gone, and the living must live well. Being overly immersed in the sorrow of the past was irresponsible for the future and the performance of a coward. His Majesty didn't come today. The old mistress nodded slightly and suddenly asked. As an emperor, Li Xian did not attend to his duties. Every day, he would visit the Li family. Occasionally, it would be Li Yi and Rui. Li Yi explained to the old mistress, he didn't come today. Rui and I just came back from Lotus Garden. Madame Dowager looked at him and asked, you and His Majesty have known each other for 4 years, right? Li thought about it and said, less than 4 years. He and Li Xian first met in July of the first year of Jinghe. Now it was March of the 5th year of Jinghe. There were still 4 months until the 4th year. 4 years is not a short time. The old mistress sighed and said, it is the Li family's fortune to be favored by 2 emperors. But you must remember that His Majesty is His Majesty. He is no longer the Crown Prince Li Xian of the past. It was said that being in the emperor's company was like living with a tiger. Since ancient times, there had been countless cases of good bows being hidden after the birds had been killed. It seemed that emperors were supposed to be cold and heartless. Most people, including the old mistress, thought so too. But none of the emperors that Li Yi knew were like this. The previous emperor was benevolent, not only toward the court but also toward people. After Li Xian became emperor, his temperament did not change at all. He was not a qualified emperor. He was straightforward and free. The things that the old mistress worried about would not happen, at least for the time being. But even though he believed in Li Xian, others did not. Since ancient times, heaven, earth, emperor, and teacher have to respect etiquette and ethics. The old mistress looked at him and sighed again. She said, "I know that you and His Majesty are close friends, but people's hearts change. For the sake of the Li family, you must be more careful and not fall too deeply into it." Li Yi thought for a long time and then lowered his head. He said, "Grandson will remember. I still envy you. You only have the title of Golden Ziguang Doctor." Li Xian put his hands behind his head as he lay on the rocking chair. Looking at the sky, he murmured, "Beautiful wives and concubines, no worldly affairs, free and unfettered. What more can a husband ask for in life? You want to take concubines?" Li Yi sat by the stone table and looked at him. He said, "If you want to do it, then do it. Your harem is so empty, it should be enriched." Li Xian looked back. The two women should be in the room. Only then did he relax. He said, "We are not the same. I only need Qin her." Li Yi suddenly asked, "How is your brother Xin?" "Brother Xin?" Li Xian thought for a moment and said, "He has already graduated from the Mathematics Institute. I feel that he is more suitable for our Academy of Sciences. I don't know where the Ministry of Appointments will send him, so I am preparing to headhunt him." Then he felt that something was wrong. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Don't try to change the topic. I, the Emperor, am not as free as you, the Marquis. This is too unreasonable." Li Xian was clearly brooding over this matter. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Prime Minister Qin has already resigned 3 times and I persuaded him to come back. The Qin family has suffered such a great change. Prime Minister Qin is disheartened and his health is not as good as before. If he has made up his mind, I will allow him to retire. After Prime Minister Qin's resignation, the position of the right minister will be vacant. Only you can take this position. At that time, you and Mingzu will be in cahoots." Li Yi pointed at Li Xian, looked behind him and said, "He is cursing you." Mingzu had just finished sparring with Rui. Her hair was wet. Li Xian jumped up from the chair and said, "I am going to see Xiao Rui." Mingzhu was a noble princess, and always had a heroic spirit that did not lose to any man. This heroic spirit was something that even the Lu's second young miss did not have. In other words, even Mississippi Lu was more feminine than Mingzhu. Of course, these words could not be said in front of him. Otherwise, he might be greeted with a beating from both women. However, when she took a bath and put up her wet hair in front of him, Li Yi felt that his understanding of her was not complete. At this time, Her Royal Highness still had a little bit of femininity. After putting up her hair, she looked at Li Yi and said in surprise, "Why are you looking at me? Is there something on my face?" Li Yi shook his head repeatedly, "No." She did not continue this topic and asked, "Did Chief Chang come to see you 2 days ago?" Li Yi was puzzled, he did not return to the palace. Mingzi shook her head and said, "He only came here to take a look around the capital and then returned to the mausoleum." Li Yi explained, "His Majesty had a few words for him to bring to me." "Father." Although her and Li Xian's identity had been announced, she was still used to calling the former emperor this way. Li Yi nodded. Mingzu looked at her, thought for a moment and asked, "What did father say?" She shouldn't have asked this question, but she wanted to know anything about her father. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "His Majesty asked me to take care of you and Li Xian." Mingzu looked at him and said, Father already said this the other night. Li Yi was speechless for a moment. He could not tell her that her father told him not to let her down in the future and that when she did not want to be the empress, they could make do with each other. His Majesty also said that Shaning is only a child now. When she grows up, she can make her own decisions. Mingzu looked at him and asked in confusion, "What does that mean?" "Yes, sir, what does that mean?" The girl ran out of the room, thought for a moment and said with some dissatisfaction, "I am already 14 years old, I am not a child anymore." Li patted her head and said, "When will you stop saying that you're not a child anymore?" "You're not a child anymore," the dizzy girl nodded and said, "When that time comes, will I be able to make my own decisions?" Li nodded, "This is your father's verbal order, it is the same as an imperial edict. I knew father treats me the best." The girl smiled excitedly and her eyes flashed. She murmured, "Can I make my own decisions? I will ask Brother Xian to write an imperial edict when I go back." Chapter 977. What are you thinking about? Li Yi flicked his finger on her forehead and said, "This imperial edict will only count when you grow up." Among the girls, Duanwu was the most obedient, Yongning was the most adorable, and Shaning was the most mischievous one. She had countless ideas and no one knew what she was thinking in her little head. "That's what I said." Shaning covered her forehead and ran away with a chuckle. Soon, she ran back and asked, "Then how old is considered to be grown up?" Li Yi rubbed her hair and said, "You will know when you grow up." After Shaning ran away, Li Yi thought of what just happened and turned to Mingzu and said, "Li Xian doesn't think before doing things. You should suppress him." "You mean the position of the right minister?" Mingzu thought about it and said, "But I think this position is quite suitable for you. Don't you want to be in cahoots with me?" "Cahoots?" Li Yi shook his head and asked, "Who's the wolf and who's the bay?" Mingzu thought about it and said, "I think it's the bay. I like to be in the top." Since the death of the former emperor at the beginning of the year, the court was generally peaceful. It wasn't until April that there was another disturbance. Prime Minister Qin resigned many times. After the emperor agreed, he was conferred the title of special minister. This was also a non-official who didn't directly participate in the court affairs. His position was even higher than the Minister of Honor. He had the right to attend the court meetings and greet the Prime Minister. The left and right ministers were the two towering pillars of the court. Now that one of them had fallen, it was natural to build another one. In recent years, the court of the Jing Kingdom was becoming younger. There weren't many senior officials like Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen left. Because of their old age, they weren't suitable for the position. A country could live without a ruler, but it couldn't live without a prime minister. In the court meeting at the beginning of April, the ownership of the right minister's position was naturally the most important. The imperial court tended to be younger, but it was not to the extent that there was a gap between the old and the young. The Wang family, the Shen family, and a limited number of officials with experience and ability could all be choices. There was no need to consider the Shen family. In the imperial court, it was impossible for the left and right ministers to come from the Shen family. The Shen family would not participate and the officials would not agree. The other officials were at a disadvantage in the struggle for the position of prime minister, either because they did not have enough experience or because they did not have enough background. On the surface, the Wang family had the greatest hope. Because of the empress, the officials were almost certain that the Wang family would rise to a higher level this time. However, His Majesty stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and wanted to bestow the position of right minister to County Marquis Li. This made all the officials' jaws drop. Although His Majesty favored County Marquis Li, he had to be fair to all the officials in the imperial court. It was a bit too much to be swayed by emotions and want to pile all the good things on County Marquis Li. What's more, the position of Prime Minister was not a cabbage. It was the cornerstone of the imperial court. It needed both ability and experience. No one doubted County Marquis Lee's ability, but his experience. Forget it, let's not talk about experience. In the past 2 years, a certain atmosphere had been formed in the imperial court. They only talked about ability, not experience. If you can do it, you can do it. If you can't, you can replace someone else. Don't mention who your father is or who your grandfather is. Of course, if the two people's ability was similar, it would depend on the father or the grandfather. As for County Marquis Lee, no one doubted his ability. Because he was too capable and too young, they didn't care about the lack of experience. They didn't even care about whether there was such a precedent, but the problem was, he was lazy. Although he held a high position, many of the officials could only see him once a year at the imperial court. He was the dean of the School of Mathematics, but he only treated the School of Mathematics as a fishing ground. He was capable, but he was lazy. If County Marquis Lee really became the Prime Minister, what was the difference between the imperial court and having only one Prime Minister? At that time, Prime Minister Shen would have to deal with all the affairs in the imperial court alone, and it would not be long before he resigned and retired. Li Xian's idea naturally attracted the opposition of the officials. Of course, for them, County Marquis Lee had no other shortcomings except laziness. Their opposition was still very vague. Even so, the atmosphere between the emperor and the officials was still a bit unpleasant. Li found that he knew Li Xian better than himself. Could this guy's brain really not work a little bit? You can leave the position of the right prime minister to the Wang family or Dong Wenyun. Li looked at him solemnly and said, "Don't give me any more trouble. If you dare to make me prime minister, I will immediately leave the capital. I know you don't care, but I just don't like how they act." Li Xian snorted coldly and said, "Since I, the emperor, can't decide anything, why do they want me to be the emperor?" Li looked at him and asked back, "Do you think you can do whatever you want as the emperor?" Li Xian waved his hand and said, "The more they want it, the more I don't want to give it to them. The more you don't want it, I still have to give it to you." Li thought for a moment and said, "Since it has come to this, in fact, what I said just now was all a lie. As a scholar, who doesn't want to become a general and become a prime minister? I refused because I know that the more I don't want it, the more you want to give it to me. This is the simplest way to advance by retreating. Do you understand?" Li Xian looked at him and frowned. "So, you also want to be the prime minister?" Li nodded solemnly and said, "Now that it has come to this, I won't hide it from you. I really want to be the prime minister." "If you want to be the prime minister, you should have said so earlier." Li Xian slapped his thigh and said, "If you had said so earlier, would have agreed when Prime Minister Qin resigned for the first time. I was afraid that you wouldn't be happy. Now, I will issue the decree in the morning court tomorrow. One must abide by the rules. Those who don't play by the rules should be struck by lightning. Young master, old Lu is here." Just when Li Yi was wondering why he became so despicable after becoming the emperor, Fang came in with County Magistrate Lu. Lu Dao could be said to be the epitome of the saying, "One never comes to a temple without a cause." Every time he came, there must be something big. And it was something bad. Therefore, Fang privately called him a jinx. "Lu Dao greets your majesty." Lu Dao first bowed to Li Xian respectfully before turning around and bowing. "Lord Li," Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Lord Lu, could it be that something big has happened this time?" Lu Dao shook his head and said, "It's nothing big. It's just that 2 young men were jealous of a girl in a brothel and tore down a brothel. Both of them were slightly injured and are now being detained by the county government. There was no need for Lu De to make a trip here just to tell him about the fight between the 2 playboys." Li thought for a moment and asked, "I'm guessing that one of the young men should be surnamed Li, right?" Lu Dao nodded and said, "One of them is Li Yingjie, the eldest son of Assistant Minister Li of the Ministry of Personnel. What about the other one?" "The other one is surnamed Wang." Li Yingjie was the son of his second uncle, Li Mingze, who was about the same age as him. Li Yi had seen him many times but had never talked to him much. Madame Dowager often mentioned him, saying that he had changed his previous playboy character, which was very rare. Not to mention that his father was an assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel who was on the rise in his career. There were not many people in the capital who would take the initiative to provoke him just because of his surname. Lu Dao's arrival had explained everything. Li Yi stood up and said, "Let's go and have a look." Chapter 978. There were many powerful officials at the feet of the emperor in the capital, and there were countless hedonistic sons. Their families all had a lot of background, and they were young and vigorous. Almost every month, as the capital magistrate, Lu Dao would handle a few such cases. These cases were not difficult, but they were also difficult. Those influential families were very prideful. Often, the two families involved would settle it in private without going through the county government. If there was no private settlement, he could judge the case impartially. The current county government was no longer what it used to be. As long as they upheld the word reason, there was no need to fear any so-called rich families. However, the situation this time was different. The Wang family could be said to be the most powerful family in the capital. Although the Li family of the Ministry of Personnel was not as powerful as the Wang family, it was supported by a bigger tree. Moreover, the Wang family and the Li family had a good relationship. As an outsider, it was better for him not to interfere. Li Yi had listened to the county magistrate's detailed explanation on the way here. It was nothing more than a fight between two young people. From verbal conflict to physical conflict, it developed into a chaotic fight. In the process, the brothel was smashed, which attracted the attention of the county government. When Li Yi and Li Xian walked into the county government, the two families were already there. It was not appropriate for the elders to interfere in the affairs of the younger generation. The Li family sent the current housekeeper. Li Yi also knew the Wang family. It was the next head of the Wang family, Wang Yong. These days, he had been repeatedly pushed to the front by the Wang family. It seemed that the position of the head of the family was already stable. Wang Yong naturally knew Li Xian. He hurriedly stood up and said respectfully, "Wang Yong greets your majesty." "Your majesty." As soon as his words came out, the people present all knelt down. Li Xian waved his hand and said, "I just came to take a look." "Get up, the case should be solved as it should be." Wang Yong nodded his head respectfully before turning to look at Li Yi. With an apologetic look on his face, he said, "Brother Li, I've caused trouble for you today. Wang Jian is the son of my second uncle, and he doesn't know the immensity of the heavens and earth. When I return, I'll definitely get my second uncle to discipline him more strictly. As for the damage to the brothel, the Wang family will definitely compensate for it." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Brother Wang, you don't have to be like this. It's normal to be young and impetuous. You and I have experienced this before. I've already asked County Magistrate Lu about it. Both of them are at fault. How can Wang Zhechuan bear the loss of the brothel? As for the apology, don't mention it again." Wang Yong knew his personality very well, so he didn't say anything. He nodded, then turned around, his face darkening. "Hurry up and apologize." The authority of the substitute clan head was still very useful. A young man with messy clothes bowed to the person opposite him and said, "I'm sorry." The other person also bowed in apology. The junior of the Wang family was quickly brought back by the servants of the Wang family. Li Yingjie was also taken away by the steward of the mansion. It was originally a conflict between the younger generation of the two families, so no one would care. Wang Yong turned around and said with a smile, "A few days ago, my father said that he hasn't seen Brother Li for a long time. The tea that the Li family sent during the New Year festival is almost finished." Li Yi smiled and said, "If Lord Wang likes it, I'll have someone send some more another day. No need for another day. Li Xian waved his hand and said, it just so happens that Qin is at the Wang family these days, and I haven't been to the Wang family for a long time. How about today, Wang family? The young man rubbed the bruise on his face and said with a displeased expression, Big brother, why do you want me to apologize? It's not like I'm the only one in the wrong. A middle-aged man said with a sullen expression, who told you to have a conflict with the Li family? The young man's expression became even more unconvinced. So what if it's the Li family? Does the Wang family have to be afraid of the Li family? The empress's surname is Wang, and the Wang family is also a century-old clan. Other than Li Yi, what else does the Li family have? Why do we have to be afraid of him? Shut up. The Wang family master, who had been silent all this time, glared at him and said in a low voice. You unfilial son, what are you saying? The middle-aged man walked forward, raised his hand, and shook it helplessly. Is this something you can say? It is. The young man curled his lips and said, he is so young, yet he has so much power. Now, he even has to fight with eldest uncle for the position of prime minister. Since ancient times, people with such power have always been feared by the emperor in the end. No one has had a good ending. Now, the officials are very afraid of him. The emperor can't tolerate him for too long. If he knows what's good for him, he should retire early. Otherwise, I want to see what will happen to him in the end. Shut up. A harsh voice resounded in everyone's ears, but it didn't come from anyone in the hall. Wang Yong walked in from outside. The young man opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but Wang Yong picked up the chair beside him and smashed it on the young man's head. The chair broke into pieces in an instant, which showed how much force Wang Yong used. The young man fell to the ground with a swollen face and a bloody nose, but he didn't faint. He looked at Wang Yong in disbelief and murmured, You haven't said enough. Wang Yong glanced at him. When he picked up the second chair, everyone in the hall came back to their senses. The Wang family master stood up and asked in surprise, Yong, what are you doing? Wang Yong threw the chair down and shook his head. The emperor and County Marquis Li were outside just now. Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. The Wang family. Li Xian's face was gloomy and his eyes were filled with disappointment. Li Yi smiled and said unconcernedly, he can't represent the Wang family. Li Xian suddenly looked at him and asked, do you think the officials really think this way? Think what? Li Yi took a sip of wine and asked casually. They think you have too much power and that I will be afraid of you. Li Xian stood up and said, since it's like this, I'll let them open their eyes and see. Li Yi had a bad feeling and asked, what are you going to do? You'll know tomorrow, Li Xian said with a dark face and strode out of the door. A moment later, in the same place. Wang Yong's expression was complicated. He sighed and said, Father has already told him to return to Luochuan. He will never set foot in the capital again in this life. Li Yi shook his head. Why is this necessary? Sister will explain it to the emperor. Wang Yong lowered his head and said, the Wang family will always be a friend of the Li family. Brother Li, don't think too much. The commoners and even the officials all thought that the Wang family was the largest family in the Jing kingdom. With the Wang family's power, they could do whatever they wanted in the Jing kingdom without fear. The Cui family thought the same back then, so the Cui family died out. From then on, he knew that some people could only be friends and not enemies. Wang Yong came to apologize on behalf of the Wang family and brought a very generous gift. Li Yi had to accept this gift. If he didn't accept it, it would be a rejection and a falling out with the Wang family. He was just an arrogant playboy and couldn't represent the Wang family. Li Yi knew this very well. Moreover, this gift was very expensive and it wouldn't be easy to return it. Li Yi saw Mingzhu in the afternoon. What happened to you and the Wang family? Mingzu walked in from outside and said in surprise, the Empress asked me to tell you that today's matter wasn't what the Wang family wanted. Li waved his hand and said, it's just a misunderstanding. Mingzu looked at him and asked doubtfully, then what are you worried about? Li sighed and said, Li Xian. Chapter 979. When the previous emperor was on the throne, he was diligent in governing the court. Unless he was seriously ill or under special circumstances, morning court was rarely interrupted. Although the current emperor was not as diligent as the previous emperor, morning court was still held every day. It was just that the person presiding over the morning court was changed to the eldest princess. The civil and military officials were used to this. It was not strange to not see the emperor during morning court, but it was strange to see the emperor. Thus, when they stood neatly in the court and saw the eldest princess and the emperor walk out from both sides, they were a little surprised. Today was not the first day of the lunar year, nor was it a special day. It was rare for the emperor to come to court. As for whether the emperor regretted his previous slacking, it was not something the officials could guess. After the slight surprise, the morning court was held as usual. An official from the Academy of Sciences reported in detail the recent research progress of the Academy. The Minister of Rights advised the emperor to expand the harem to stabilize the foundation of the country. A senior censor said that the Prime Minister could not be left vacant. The current Prime Minister of Qin was old, and a new Prime Minister had to be chosen as soon as possible. The emperor highly praised the research of the Academy of Sciences and ignored the Minister of Rights. He looked at the officials and slowly said, I already have a candidate in mind for the Prime Minister position. There is no need to say more. Many people in the court felt bitter when they heard this. They said more because the emperor already had a candidate in mind. The candidate he had in mind was really not suitable for the position of Prime Minister. Li Xian looked at the eunuch beside him and slowly said, announce the decree. Yes, Your Majesty. The eunuch nodded respectfully and took out an imperial decree. He walked forward and glanced at the officials below. It was this one glance that caused everyone to feel a sense of foreboding. At this moment, the eunuch's shrill voice came from above. The imperial decree. Countless people's hearts sank when they heard the word imperial edict. The wording of the imperial decree was very particular. The wording was different depending on the content. There were three main types: imperial decree, regulation, and imperial decree. Imperial decree was used to reward and also to warn. Regulation was used to announce to the officials and express the emperor's favor. As for imperial decree, it was used to announce to the world that it was not used unless it was an important matter. The emperor used imperial decree to appoint a crown prince and a princess. More importantly, there was no need for an imperial edict to be conferred the title of prime minister. The Marquis of Chang and County, Li Yi, is intelligent and has made great achievements. Since the early years of Jinghe, he created Tianfa, offered horseshoes, changed interrogation by torture, repelled the enemy, opened the school of mathematics, and stopped the flood. The eunuch was still reading aloud. The ears of the hundreds of officials in the hall were buzzing. Marquis Li Yi of Chang and County. Sure enough, sure enough. As expected, His Majesty did not listen to his advice and insisted on making County Marquis Li the Prime Minister. He would be the youngest Prime Minister in the history of the Jing Kingdom, and the laziest Prime Minister. Immediately, the faces of several censors and old officials changed. They stood out from the crowd. Before the imperial edict was finished, they were not allowed to interrupt. Otherwise, it would be a serious crime. But at this moment, everyone could see the determination on their faces. Get rid of the vermin, sweep away the crooks, push forward the reforms. Your contributions are great. Confer the title of Jiang of Silla to show the grace of the heavens. Pass it on forever. Take it and rest. Brilliant. The eunuch's voice was still echoing in the hall. Inside the hall, the expressions of some people finally relaxed. Not the Prime Minister. It turned out that it was just to confer the title of Jiang of Silla, not the Prime Minister. It seemed that His Majesty was still, Jing. Jiang of Silla. One word king. Jing was the title of the Jing kingdom. Jiang of Silla had always been the most respected prince. Since decades ago, there had been no Jiang of Silla in the royal family. Now, His Majesty conferred this title to a person with a different surname, a person who was not from the royal family. This was ridiculous. This was the biggest joke in the world. Mingzu looked at Li Xian, who had a serious face. Her lips moved, but she did not say anything in the end. Your Majesty. Your Majesty, please think twice. It is against the ancestral rules for a foreign official to be conferred the title of king. Your Majesty, please think twice. The imperial court was in an uproar. Countless officials knelt down and said loudly, I have made up my mind. Li Xian waved his hand and walked out from the side. A eunuch said loudly, court dismissed. Prime Minister Shen, say something. Lord Wang, we can't let His Majesty act willfully. Lord Yang, please go and see the Empress Dowager. We can't let His Majesty act so willfully. Princess, Your Highness, please persuade His Majesty again. After the officials got up, they immediately placed their last hope on a few important officials. The head of the Wang family sighed. He knew why His Majesty would do this, so he also knew that His Majesty would not retract this imperial edict. An old man shook his head and said, His Majesty is different from the late emperor. At this time, no one can say anything. Prime Minister Shen looked out of the palace with his murky eyes and murmured, No, there is one more person. His Majesty will definitely listen to his words. In a certain palace in the imperial harem, Wang Qin brought a cup of tea and put it in front of Li Xian. She said softly, My husband, don't be angry, they said I was suspicious of him. Li Xian held her hand and asked her to sit aside. Then he sighed and said, Qin, do you think he can understand what I did? Wang Qin sighed, but she could only sigh. There were some things that even if she could see clearly, she couldn't explain to him. He was worried that County Marquis Li would overthink because of the rumors outside, but he didn't know that the more he thought like this, the worse his situation would be. Today, not only the imperial court was in an uproar, but even the common people were also in an uproar in a very short time. Since His Majesty ascended the throne, County Marquis Li's power had reached its peak. Since ancient times, such officials never had a good ending. Not only the officials in the imperial court, but also the common people in the capital were guessing that it wouldn't be long before His Majesty began to suspect him. The decline of the Li family was a foregone conclusion. Who would have thought that after such a short period of time, His Majesty would give all of them a resounding slap in the face? Jiang of Silla, king of the one word, a foreign official being made a king. Since the founding of the country, no foreign official had ever received such an honor. Although County Marquis Li's achievements were great and no one in the imperial court could compare to him, in the end, he didn't have the merit of opening up territory. If he led troops to destroy the Qi kingdom or the Zhao kingdom, it would be understandable if he was made a king. But now, he was too young. This emperor's favor was a bit too much. Just like that, he was made a king of the one word. The emperor had directly expressed his attitude. In the future, who in the entire capital would dare to provoke the Li family? The Li family. The head of the family being made a king was a great honor. The entire manor was in jubilation. Li Yi had just sent off the worried old woman and sat back in the courtyard. He rubbed his slightly swollen head when the princess walked in from outside. He sighed and said, Didn't we agree to have you stop him? Mingzi shook her head and said, You know that no one can stop him if he wants to do something. Why do you have to stop me? Li Xian walked out from the back and said, "You have done so much for the Jing kingdom and the world. What is a mere king? Have you not counted how many foreign officials have been made kings since the founding of the Jing kingdom?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "You don't care what the court officials think or what the people think. I don't care what they think." Li Xian looked at him and said seriously, "I only care what you think." Chapter 980. Li Yi knew what Li Xian was thinking, but he didn't know that he would actually do this. Jiang of Silla, king of the One Word, was practically the person with the highest status in the Jing kingdom, other than the emperor. This was what it meant to be under one person and above millions. He didn't try to persuade Li Xian to retract the edict, because what was more influential than a foreign official being made a king was to retract the edict after being made a king. Normal people understood that a gentleman's words cannot be retracted by 4 horses, and as an emperor, his words were even more important. Li Xian didn't care about this at all. He said, "Don't worry, if the officials object, I will take responsibility." At this moment, it was too late to say anything. He knew Li Xian's personality better than anyone else. Li Yi shook his head and said, "Let's not talk about this, let's drink." The wine was made by Xiao Zhu. Xiao Zhu's wine had 2 characteristics. One was that it tasted sweet, and the other was that it went to the head easily. Li Xian gulped down 2 cups and started to sway. "Tell me, what's so good about being an emperor and a prince? Why are there so many people fighting to the death?" Li Xian's eyes were hazy from drunkenness. He murmured, "I still feel that those days in Qing and prefecture were the most comfortable, the most carefree." Li Yi actually wasn't in the mood to drink. Today's events, Li Xian had only started. The troublesome things were still to come. "I know you don't want to be a prince, but I want to shut their mouths." Li Xian slapped the table and suddenly said, "This capital is not interesting at all. Why don't we run? Didn't you say that there's a fun place near Shuzhou that no one can control? Why don't we go there?" Li Emingzu looked at the 2 people beside her and shook her head slightly. The person who least wanted to be an emperor had become an emperor, and the person who least wanted to be a prince had become a prince. Sometimes, things in this world were so ironic. She stood up and lightly tapped Li Xian's shoulder. He immediately fell asleep on the table. She sat back down and looked at Li Yi, asking, "What should we do now?" Ever since Li Xian succeeded to the throne, Li Yi had been aware of certain things. However, he hadn't expected that Li Xian's sudden action would push a certain contradiction to the peak. "I don't know." He shook his head, looked at her and asked, "Are you hungry? I'll cook you a bowl of rice." "I'm not hungry." Mingzu shook her head. "1 egg or 2? 2. Reincarnation was a technical job. If one was born in the family of an emperor, king, general, or minister, they would not have to worry about food and drink for the rest of their lives. They would enjoy endless glory, splendor, and wealth. If they were born in a commoner's family, they would be born a notch lower than others. They would need to put in more hardships and effort than those people to earn a good future, but they might not be able to catch up to those people. Among these, the best situation was to reincarnate into the family of an emperor. Without any effort, they would be born princes and princesses. Children born in poverty might be able to change their fate with hard work and become a general and minister, but their birth had already determined that the highest they could achieve in this life was to become a general and minister. If they wanted to go one step further, they could only pray for a good reincarnation in their next life. However, there was always an exception. Yesterday's County Marquis Li and today's Jiang of Silla had created a precedent that had never been seen since the founding of the Jing kingdom. There was a lot of discussion among the people. Other than expressing surprise, there wasn't anything else. On the imperial edict, the achievements of Jiang of Silla over the years were clearly written. In these years, many good changes had happened around them. People could almost see the shadow of Jiang of Silla in almost everything. He was made an exception to be conferred the title of king. It was unexpected, but also reasonable. There were not many objections from the people. However, because of this matter, the court and the royal family had a very tense relationship with the current emperor. There was no need to talk about the royal family. They all came from the Li family. How could they easily allow an outsider to interfere? Led by a few old members of the royal family with the surname Li and Jingdo, they protested to the emperor. The princes outside had not received the news, but presumably, they would not agree. In the court, there were already some complaints about the emperor's stubborn insistence on making County Marquis Li of prime minister. Now, the emperor did not make him prime minister and directly made him a king. In the future, when the prime minister saw him, he would also have to bow, following an emperor who would flip the table at the slightest disagreement. It was really a headache. Whether it was the people, the court, or the royal family, Li Yi did not pay attention to any of them. After being conferred the title of king, he did not even invite guests to celebrate. There was no difference from the past. If one had to go into detail, there was still a difference. In the past, it was very leisurely at home. Now, he had to look after 3 children at the same time, Li Duan, Yongning, and Shaoning. The 3 of them could not even handle it. He couldn't help but imagine his future and couldn't help but worry. Of course, Shaoning was no longer a child. Many times, she could help him look after the children. This was a very good change. Fong stood behind him with some confusion and asked, "Son-in-law, do we really not need to change the signboard on our door?" Li Yi waved his hand. "No need. I have no choice but to change it." Old Fong shook his head and said, "Son-in-law is now a prince, so the entrance can't be so shabby. We have to change 2 bigger stone lions, and the plaque should also be changed. Let's talk about it later." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Is there anything important these few days?" "Important?" Fong scratched his head and said, "The important thing is that you have been conferred the title of Jiang of Silla. There seems to be nothing else." "Right, yesterday, the Baldy sent a letter. He said that he now has a lot of people under him. They have built a city in the mountains. I don't know the specifics. These things are all managed by Second Mississippi. If son-in-law wants to know, I can go to Second Miss to get the information." Fong got up and left. Soon, he came back and said, "Son-in-law, there is an old man outside looking for you." The old man who came to find him should be one of the most powerful old men in the Jing kingdom. Li Yi stood up and walked to the front hall. He cupped his hands to the old man who was waiting in the hall. "I didn't know that Prime Minister Shen was coming. I didn't go out to greet you." Prime Minister Shen stood up and bowed in return. He said, "This old man can't accept a bow from Jiang of Silla. The Li family and the Shen family could be considered to have some friendly relations." Prime Minister Shen had stood behind him several times in the court. He had people serve good tea, and after chatting for a while, he opened his mouth and asked, "Right now, only Prime Minister Shen is supporting the court. You should be very busy. How come you have the time to come here to drink tea?" Prime Minister Shen smiled and shook his head. He said, "This old man didn't come here to drink tea with Jiang of Silla." He put down the teacup and said, "Although Jiang of Silla is not in the court, I think he should know about the situation in the court these days." Li Yi didn't deny it. Prime Minister Shen raised his teacup and said with a smile, "This old man hasn't thanked Jiang of Silla for Su's matter." He was talking about Shen Su disguising herself as a man and sneaking into the mathematics academy. Li Yi suddenly realized that Prime Minister Shen had always kept a low profile in the court. He was the complete opposite of Prime Minister Qin and belonged to the gentle faction. But at their age, which one of them who could get to this position was not an old fox? The matter between Shen Su and Li Xian, whether it was unintentional or the Shen family intentionally pushed it, was ultimately the Shen family who benefited. He couldn't help but look at the old man in front of him in a new light. Li Yi didn't respond, and Prime Minister Shen didn't continue on this topic. He looked at him and slowly said, I think Jiang of Silla knows His Majesty's temperament better than anyone else. His Majesty has fallen out with the court officials and clan members this time. The court is not stable. If this continues, there will be great losses. Only you can persuade His Majesty. Li Yi looked at him and asked, What do you want me to do? Prime Minister Shen shook his head. This old man doesn't know what to do, but I know that His Highness Jiang of Silla definitely knows. You are not me. How do you know that I know? Jiang of Silla is also not me. How do you know that I don't know? If he continued to ask, he would be suspected of exaggerating the number of words. Li Yi shook his head and didn't want to argue with the old man in front of him. There were some things that everyone was well aware of. At this point, he couldn't say any more. Chapter 981. This old man will take his leave. Take care, Prime Minister Shen. After sending off Prime Minister Shen, Li Yi walked back to the courtyard and sat down. Prime Minister Shen did not come today to discuss the philosophical problem of man is not fish with him. Li Xian was stubborn and did things based on his passion. But as a scientist, he had a very important trait, persistence. He persisted until he hit the southern wall and did not turn back. After that, he continued to stride forward. When the former emperor was on the throne, he did not make arbitrary decisions. Most of the time, he would discuss with the court officials and take into consideration the opinions of the court officials. Li Xian usually did not care much about political affairs. But when he decided on something, no matter how many people opposed it, it could not change his mind. In the past, he was the crown prince. There was still Prince Ning and the former emperor who could restrain him. Now that he was the emperor, the entire world was his and no one could restrain him. If the royal family and the court officials continued to be in a deadlock with him, the one who would last until the end would definitely be Li Xian. As for Li Yi, he was pushed to the front just like that. But this could not be blamed on him. He never did things in a roundabout way. If the court officials felt that he was suspicious of him, he would be bestowed the title of Prime Minister. If the court officials continued to be suspicious, he would be bestowed the title of King. This was his attitude. Simple and straightforward, slightly rough. This was a method that made people feel angry, funny and touched. It was even a little childish. Of course, this kind of childishness was not a good thing when it appeared on the ruler of a country. In the courtyard, Xiao Zhu, Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui were playing kuju. Li Yi waved to her and said, Xiao Zhu, help me warm a pot of grape wine later. Okay, I will go immediately. Xiao Zhu passed the rattan ball to Xiao Huan and ran towards the kitchen. Li Yi thought for a moment and added, this time, make it less strong. Mississippi Liu was not at home, so there was no one to drink with him. Li Yi poured himself a cup of wine and drank by himself, thinking about what had happened just now. In another direction, Rui withdrew her gaze and said in a low voice, even though he has been conferred the title of king, my husband is still not happy. Ruoqing had a worried look on her face as she said, this time, he was conferred the title of Jiang of Silla. It seems to be a great favor, but too much may not be a good thing. After His Majesty ascended the throne, the Li family had already made many people afraid. This time, with the great favor of the emperor, they will be even more afraid. It is not a good thing to stand out in the forest. Rui had a thoughtful look on her face. She looked in that direction for a long time before saying, there's something I want to discuss with my two younger sisters. She whispered a few words, and a smile appeared on Drunken Mo's face. She said, as you wish, sister. Ruoqing also nodded and said, I'll listen to you. Li Yi drank grape wine as he thought about this matter. Before the previous emperor died, he had given Emingzu and Li Xian to him to watch over the court and the world. Later, he had Chang to bring a message for him to take care of Yongning and Shaoning. He was not their nanny, so what right did he have? At that time, he had been blinded by greed and agreed to take care of Yongning, Shaoning, and Emingzu. This was what he should do. Take care of Li Xian, who asked him to be his only good brother. He accepted it, but to ask him to take care of the entire court and the world was a bit too much. At first, he had thought that a gentleman's word could not be retracted. If he wanted to take care of them, then so be it. But now, he wanted Li Xian to sit firmly in this position. The ruler and officials were in harmony, and the court was stable. He also wanted to stay in Jingdo and watch over the world of the Li family for him. These two matters conflicted. Up until now, he still hadn't thought of a suitable solution. A sliver of indignation rose in Li Yi's heart. The old emperor, oh, the old emperor. Did he lie to his daughter or something? Before he left, he still had to trick him. He frowned and reached for the wine pot, but he caught nothing. Rui picked up the wine pot and filled his cup to the brim. She also poured a cup for herself. Looking at him, she smiled and said, "Let me drink with you." Rui usually didn't drink, not even grape wine. Other than that one time when she was pestered by Li Yi to make up for it, she had never taken the initiative to drink. Surprised, Li Yi clinked his cup with hers. She took a small sip before looking at Li Yi and saying, "There is something I want to discuss with you." Rui didn't use this kind of tone and expression to talk to him. Li Yi asked in confusion, "What is it?" Rui looked at him and said, "I want to go out for a walk." Hearing this, Li Yi was stunned. He then stood up and said, "I want to go out for a walk with my wife. I'm not talking about outside the house." Rui shook her head and said, "I'm talking about outside the capital. After staying in the capital for so long, I'm a bit bored. I want to bring my husband, Duaner, Rui, Xiaohuan, and my two younger sisters out to play for a few days and see the scenery. The last time I went out with my husband was more than 2 years ago." Rui rarely took the initiative to make a request of him. Li Yi thought for a moment and didn't think for long. He nodded and said, "Okay." The world was so big. If Rui wanted to go out and see, he naturally had to accompany her. However, this way, he would probably have to go back on his promise to the old emperor. Forget it. If he went back on his promise, then so be it. At most, the next time they met, he would let him kick him a few times to vent his anger. He looked at Rui and asked, "Wife, where do you want to go?" "Of course, my husband." Li Yi nodded and asked again, "Then when are we leaving?" Rui thought for a moment and said, "We have to leave some time to prepare. Why don't we leave at the beginning of next month?" There was still more than half a month until the beginning of next month. There was enough time to prepare. Li Yi stood up and let out a long sigh of relief. This trip would probably take a long time. There were some things he needed to explain to the old madam. The brothels and shops in the capital had to be arranged properly. The brothels and shops had already formed a system. He didn't need to interfere too much. Even if he left for a year or two, they would still be able to operate normally. There was no need to worry too much. As for where to go this time, he needed to think carefully. Li Yi sat in the courtyard thinking. Mississippi Lu carried a small wine jar and sat opposite him. Mississippi Lu always drank from a bowl. Li Yi poured himself a bowl of wine and asked, "How has Lu Meng been recently?" Mississippi Lu replied casually, "Same as usual." Li Yi asked again, "Any news from the fringe?" Mississippi Lu said casually, "For the past 2 years, Lu Meng has been sending people there. They have conquered some territories. It's considered some achievements." If Mississippi Lu used some achievements to describe it, it must be more than just some achievements. Back then, he just happened to pass by there and arranged something. He didn't think much about it. Now, it was an unexpected gain. Thinking of something, Li Yi suddenly asked, "Rui, do you have any particular place you want to go?" "No." Mississippi Lu shook her head. "Think about it carefully." Li Yi looked at her and said, "When you were young is fine too. Do you have any places you want to go, things you want to do, or ideals?" "When I was young," Mississippi Lu thought for a moment and looked at him. She asked, "Does becoming the king of bandits count?" "Yes." Li Yi was stunned. Then, he looked at her and murmured, "King of bandits, what a coincidence." Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "You wanted to be the king of bandits when you were young?" Li Yi thought for a moment and nodded. "More or less." Chapter 982. Two tigers cannot share one mountain. In this world, there can only be one person who can become the king of bandits. Unless it's a male tiger and a female tiger. Unless one of them is a woman who wants to be the king of bandits, and the other is a man who wants to be the king of bandits. The chances of winning against Mississippi Lu for that position were slim. Li Yi could only choose the second option. "I have something to tell you." He picked up the bowl with one hand and gulped down the wine in it. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said, "We're leaving." Mississippi Lu finally raised her head and looked at him. She asked, "Where are we going?" "The world is so big. While we're still young, how can we not go out and see the world?" Li Yi looked at her and said, "Haven't we achieved some results in the fringe? Why don't we go there with Lu Meng and occupy all the mountains there? We will unify all the bandits in the fringe. Those who submit to us will prosper, and those who oppose us will perish. Whoever dares to resist will be beaten up until they stop resisting. This way, not only will we rid the people of evil, you will also realize your childhood dream." This news was a little sudden. Mississippi Lu was stunned for a moment. Then, she looked at him and asked, "Really?" "Of course. Why would I lie to you?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "When we unify the fringe and consolidate the forces there, we will go to the Wu Kingdom. Isn't your disciple rebelling in the Wu Kingdom? We'll help her drag that dog of a king of the Wu Kingdom down from the throne. What do you think?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and asked, "You're not going to be the Jiang of Silla?" Li Yi waved his hand and said nonchalantly, "What Jiang of Silla? How is Jiang of Silla more important than realizing your dream?" Mississippi Lu thought for a moment and nodded. "I think your suggestion is good. Sir, I just heard Sister Rui say something about leaving." When Li Yi was packing things in the room, Shanning held Yongning's hand and walked in from outside. She asked, "Are you going out to play?" "Where are you going?" "For how long?" "I'm going to a very far place." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I don't know how long I'll be gone." Shanning looked at him and asked, "Just like last time?" Yongning clearly remembered what happened last time. She walked over and hugged Li Yi's arm. She begged in a soft voice, "Brother, I want to go too. Don't leave Sini behind." Li Yi carried her up and said with a smile, "Of course I have to bring Sini along." Shanning looked a little hesitant as she asked, "Is it as long as the last time?" "Maybe a little longer than the last time." Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Bing Ning, do you want to go?" "If it's that long, Mother won't agree." She showed a hopeful look on her face, but in the end, she could only shake her head gloomily and said, "I'll wait at home for you to come back." Li Yi nodded. She had a distressed look on her face and murmured, "Next time, when I grow up, you must bring me along when you go out to play." "Okay." Li Yi smiled and put Yongning down. He said, "Go play." Looking at the two little girls walking out hand in hand, Li Yi retracted his gaze. There was a trace of a complicated look on his face. The lake in the academy had now become the most popular place in the 3 academies. The lakeside was filled with green plants, and the bluestone road was paved with long benches for people to rest on. It was the first choice of the academy's students for their morning recitation. It was now class time, and there were not many people in the academy. On the bluestone road, Li Yi, Li Xian, and Emingzu walked side by side. Because of their identities, the former three heroes of the capital were no longer addressed as such. Li Xian turned his head and looked around. He sighed and said, "In these 2 years, the capital has changed a lot. Thinking back to when I first came to the capital, I really can't recognize it." This sentence should not be said by him, because the people who had caused these changes in the capital were here. In these 2 years, they had almost turned the capital upside down. They had built the 3 academies, fought against the king of Shu, fought against the Cui family, and overcome all kinds of obstacles in the court. They had implemented a new system, and had established the current situation in the capital. Li Xian did not feel that it was shameless to say this. He said as he walked, "In a few days, I plan to expand this place and build a few more academies. The Academy of Sciences should also be divided. By then, you can give me some ideas. I will leave the capital for a while. What do you think about merging the School of Mathematics into the Academy of Sciences?" But Han might not be willing. Li Xian was startled. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "What did you just say?" Li Yi looked at the lake and said, "In a few days, I may not be of much help. I will leave the capital soon." Li Xian stopped, and Emingzu also looked at him. "Leave the capital?" Li Xian looked at him and asked in disbelief, "If you leave, what about your family's brothel and shop in the capital?" Li Yi looked at him strangely and asked, "I will only go out to play with Rui and the others." "What brothel and shop?" "Speaking of the brothel and shop, you have to help me keep an eye on them while I am away. Don't let anyone bully them. You are now the Jiang of Silla. Who would dare to cause trouble for your family's brothel and shop?" Li Xian frowned and said, "Why are you suddenly leaving? My wife said she was tired of staying in the capital and wanted to go out for a walk. What can I do?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "Besides, there is no point in staying in the capital all the time. It is good to go out and see the scenery." Li Xian looked disappointed. He then sighed and said, "I really envy you. You can leave whenever you want." He looked at Li Yi and asked, "How long will you be away this time?" Li Yi thought about it and said, "At least half a year. At most, it is hard to say." Li Xian looked at him and said in surprise, "So long?" "I don't know the exact time. If I don't take advantage of my youth to see the great rivers and mountains, there will be no more opportunities in the future." Li Yi shook his head and said, "By the way, I want to bring Yongning with me this time. I am worried that if I leave her for too long, her illness will relapse. That child will only be close to you." Li Xian was slightly depressed, but he still nodded and said, "I will give an order." "When will you leave?" "At the beginning of next month." "No, you still have to give me some ideas about the Academy of Sciences." Li Xian shook his head and said, "If you leave, it will be difficult for me to do these things in the future. Wait here for a while. I will immediately go to the Academy of Sciences to get the materials." After Li Xian left in a hurry, only he and Emingzu were left here. The princess had her head lowered since the beginning and did not say a word. After Li Xian left, she walked alone in the direction of the pavilion in the middle of the lake. Li Yi followed her to the pavilion. She finally asked, "Where are you going this time?" Li Yi thought about it and said, "My current plan is to go all the way west. I will first go to Qing and Prefecture, and in the end, I will probably go to Shuzhou." Emingzu suddenly looked up at him and asked, "Are you coming back?" "How is that possible?" Li Yi said with a smile. He looked into her eyes and then lowered his head. The two of them fell into a long silence. Emingzu did not ask any more because she knew why Li Yi had left. As long as he was still in Jingdou, the conflict between Li Xian and the officials would not be resolved. If a prince who was favored by the emperor and had power greater than the heaven stayed in Jingdo, countless people would not be able to sleep at night. He chose to leave for Li Xian. If he still wanted to come back, he would not think about leaving. After an indeterminable amount of time, Li Yi finally raised his head. Seeing her serious expression, he reached out to tug at the corner of her mouth and pulled out a smile. He said with a smile, "Of course I will come back. You are still here, how can I not come back?" Mingzu did not care about the hand that was playing tricks on her face. She stretched out her little finger and said, "Pinky swear." Seeing her action, Li Yi was first startled. Then he also stretched out his little finger and entwined it with hers. He said, "Pinky swear." Mingzu stretched out her thumb and pressed it tightly against his. "Pinky swear, hang yourself. Don't change for 100 years. Chapter 983. The capital is not peaceful these days. It's good for you to go out for a walk, the old madam hugged Li Duan and sighed. But Duaner is still so young. Will he be able to endure such a long journey? Li Yi comforted her. It's a slow journey. There's no rush. The journey was long, and it was inevitable that the horses and carriage would be tired. However, the Li family's carriages were specially designed and had good shock absorption. In terms of comfort, even Li Xian's imperial carriage could not compare, so it was not a big problem. Every time you go to a place, write a letter to Grandma. The old madam looked at him and warned him. I don't know how long my old bones can last. I'm afraid I won't see the day Duaner grows up. Li Yi shook his head. Master Tan Yin said that Grandma's body is healthy. It's not difficult for you to live to 100 years old. You will definitely see that day. I don't ask for a long life. I'm already satisfied to see you all well. The old madam sighed again. This trip will not be short. You will have to personally visit some manors. Li Yi nodded. I know. With his current identity and status, as well as his connections in the capital, even if he left, he could not leave quietly. He could not go on a trip with Rui like last time. Moreover, the meaning of this departure was completely different from the last time. Qin Manor. An old man in a plain gray robe personally brewed a cup of tea and handed it to the opposite side. He shook his head. I thought that the court was now clear and bright and talented people were emerging. I didn't expect that there would still be so many short-sighted people. They are muddle-headed. After Prime Minister Qin resigned, he became more spirited. He had just chatted with him and learned that after the old man resigned, he drank tea and listened to the opera every day. This old man who had worked hard for the country for a lifetime, although he could not be said to be happy in his later years, at least he had some leisure. He had acted on the stage for a lifetime. Now, it was time to sit down and listen to the opera. Li Yi took a sip of tea and smiled. It's rare for a person to be muddle-headed in this lifetime. Prime Minister Qin shook his head and said, I know that the reasons His Majesty used to grant you the title of king are not everything you have. They lost a chance to sweep away all the countries and unify the world. Li Yi smiled and drank his tea, lowering his head in silence. It's so difficult that I'm confused. The old man stood up and said, Let's go. This Jing kingdom can't keep you here. I want to go out for a walk as well. If I walk more after eating, perhaps I can live a few more years. Let's see how far you can go. I only hope that when the time comes, you won't point your sword at the Jing kingdom. Li Yi shook his head. Prime Minister Qin, you worry too much. I'm no longer Prime Minister Qin. The old man smiled and said, It's rare to be muddle-headed. He walked out of the door with the help of his walking stick, followed closely by an old servant. When Li Yi walked out of Qin Manor, he saw a few figures walking towards him. Be careful. Qin he supported a woman and carefully walked up the steps. The woman's belly was slightly bulging, indicating that she was pregnant. The woman's face was somewhat familiar. Li Yi quickly remembered that she was Lady Shuang's older sister, the girl called Lin Qin, who had cried out in front of the Ministry of Justice. Help Madam inside first. Qin he ordered the two servant girls behind him, turned around, bowed, and said, This commoner greets Jiang of Silla. A man stood behind Qin he. When he saw Li Yi, his eyes revealed joy. Li Yi nodded slightly. When he passed by them, he paused and asked, With your courage and ability, have you never thought about becoming an official in the court and reviving the Qin family? Becoming an official in the court. Qin he smiled and then said, Becoming an official in the court is boring, and reviving the family is even more boring. How can it be as free as being a commoner? Your Highness Jiang of Silla, what do you think? Li Yi turned around and looked at the woman who had already gone far away. He raised his hand slightly and said, Congratulations in advance. Thank you, Your Highness. Fong sat in the carriage and asked, Son-in-law, where are we going now? In the capital today, there were not many mansions that were worthy of him personally visiting. Li Yi thought about it and said, to General Shui's manor. Although old General Shui's address had the word old in it, other than the white hair on his head and the wrinkles on his face, he had nothing to do with the word old. When Li Yi and Fong walked in, he was bare-chested and running around the courtyard with two huge stone padlocks in his hands. When he saw Li Yi enter, he looked around and frowned. You brat, you really don't know the rules anymore. How can you not bring a gift when visiting the Venerable One's house? Li Yi waved his hand and said, I'm only here to see if old General Shui is still healthy. I'm not here as a guest. It seems that old General Shui is still strong despite his old age. I'll take my leave now. You still want to leave? What kind of place do you think the Shui Manor is? You can come and go as you please. Old General Shui threw over one of the stone padlocks in his hand. Li Yi caught it and threw it to Fong behind him. He turned around and said, The Shui Manor is a general's manor, not a bandit's lair. There's no need to be so overbearing, right? Old General Shui grinned and said, You don't say. My old Shui family's ancestors were indeed bandits. They followed the founding emperor to conquer the world and became a general. That's a coincidence. Li Yi smiled and said, My ancestors were also bandits. We're both bandits, but the difference is really big. Old General Shui looked at him with eyes that shone brightly. He said, I've long said that you are suitable for the army. I didn't think that your skinny arms and legs would hide so deeply. He then looked at Fong, who was tossing the stone padlock around like it was a rock. He said in surprise, if this was on the battlefield, he would be able to fight against 10 soldiers. Why, are you interested in joining the army? This old man can guarantee that within 2 years, you will at least become a chiliarch. Although old General Shui was a sly old fox, he was still not good enough to fool Fong. He was much more interested in being a bandit than a chiliarch. Within 2 years, he might be able to borrow the heads of 2 chiliarchs to play with. Let's talk about this in the future. Li Yi shook his head and said, I'm here this time to bid you farewell. Farewell. Old General Shui was startled, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He turned around and ordered a servant of the Shui Manor, Go, call old Ma and the others over. The general's residences were not far from each other. Back when the imperial court divided the houses, the civil officials and military officials were separated very widely. Not long after, the few old generals appeared in the main hall of the Shui Manor. Old General Ma sighed and said, His Majesty's insistence on conferring the title of king to you is indeed somewhat inappropriate. Otherwise, the situation would not have turned out like this. Li Yi shook his head and said, It's not just because of this reason. I have more important things to do. Old General Shui turned to look at him and asked, what important things? Li Yi shook his head and did not reply. Let's not talk about this. Let's drink. Old General Ma slapped the table in annoyance and said, let's not talk about these bullsh** tea matters. Go and do whatever you want to do. Don't worry, with us old fellows in the capital, we will definitely protect the Li family. Li Yi came to visit these old generals with this intention. His only family was not afraid of anything, but the old Mistress Li family was different. With the double insurance of Li Xian and these old generals, he could only leave with peace of mind. He raised his wine cup and said, let me toast to the generals. Old General Shui waved his hand and said, at this time, you brats still want to play tricks. Toast to this old man first. Old General Ma said angrily, Old Shui, why should I toast to you first? Is your face bigger or that thing bigger? Old General Shui said mockingly, in terms of face, this old man can't compare to your horse face. In terms of that thing, who has this old man been afraid of? Why don't we compete? I'm afraid of you. Li Yi hurriedly pulled the two of them apart and said, didn't we compete last time? Let's not compete today. Let's drink. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.